What if Monkey D. Luffy was raised and trained by Dracule Mihawk, the world's strongest swordsman from age 7? This concept is absolutely broken. Mihawk's legendary discipline and master-level swordsmanship combined with Luffy's rubber powers would create techniques that have never existed before. We're talking Gear 4th sword techniques, advanced future sight developed early, and a black blade forged through pure mastery. So we took this insane concept and ran it through the entire One Piece storyline, following Luffy as the Hawk's heir, who defeats Crocodile with advanced Haki, negotiates with Big Mom through tactical brilliance, and faces Kaido as someone truly worthy of the Pirate King title. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring that bell because you do not want to miss this masterpiece. Alright, let's dive into this story. The morning mist clung to Foosha Village like a shroud, unusual for the typically sunny East Blue Island. Fishermen who'd been preparing their nets since dawn found themselves squinting through the gray haze, muttering about bad omens and delayed catches. But it wasn't the weather that sent a chill through their bones, it was the sight of the black coffin-shaped boat cutting through the fog like a blade through silk. Dracule Mihawk, the world's strongest swordsman, had come to Dawn Island. The legendary Shichibukai sat motionless in his ornate chair, golden eyes scanning the approaching shoreline with predatory focus. Yoru, the world's strongest blade, rested against his shoulder, a casual gesture that could split mountains. His destination wasn't this small fishing village, but the rumors he'd heard in the taverns of Logtown had been intriguing. An ancient blade, they say, buried somewhere on Dawn Island during the Void Century. Worth more than a kingdom's treasury. Mihawk cared little for treasure, but a blade with such history, that demanded investigation. As his boat scraped against the wooden dock, the few early rising villagers scattered like startled birds. All except one. "Hey, big scary guy," the voice rang out across the harbor, high, fearless, and undeniably young. Mihawk's eyes shifted downward to find its source. A boy, no more than 7 years old, standing defiantly on the dock with a gnarled piece of driftwood clutched in both hands like a sword. The child was small, even for his age, with wild black hair and a straw hat hanging around his neck. His clothes were simple, blue shorts, a red vest, and sandals that had seen better days. But what caught Mihawk's attention wasn't his appearance, it was his stance. Crude, untrained, but instinctively sound. The boy's left foot was slightly forward, weight distributed properly, and despite the obvious fear trembling through his small frame, his grip on the makeshift weapon remained steady. "You're not welcome here," the boy declared, voice cracking slightly but maintaining its defiant edge. "This village is under my protection." A soft sound escaped Mihawk's lips, not quite a laugh, but perhaps the ghost of one. In his decades of wandering the seas, challenging the strong and cutting down the weak, he'd never encountered such brazen foolishness. The boy couldn't possibly know who he was facing, yet he stood his ground with the kind of resolve most Marines lacked. "Your protection," Mihawk's voice was soft, carrying the weight of distant thunder. He stepped from his boat onto the dock, his massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed the small boy whole. "And what, pray tell, do you intend to protect them from?" "From you," Luffy, for that was indeed Monkey D. Luffy, though Mihawk didn't yet know it, raised his driftwood sword higher, the tip wavering only slightly. "You look scary and scary mean people hurt nice people, so I won't let you." The logic was sound, if painfully simplistic. Mihawk found himself genuinely curious about this strange child. In a world where most people fled at the mere mention of his name, here stood a boy ready to fight a battle he couldn't possibly win, armed with nothing but a piece of sea-worn wood and an iron will. "I see." Mihawk took another step forward, noting how the boy's stance adjusted automatically to maintain distance, another good instinct. "And if I were to refuse your protection, then I'll make you leave." Luffy's declaration was absolute, carrying the kind of certainty only children possessed. "I've been practicing. Makino says I'm getting really good." At the mention of the barmaid's name, Mihawk's eyes flicked toward Party's bar. Through the windows, he could see a young woman with green hair pressed against the glass, her face pale with terror. Around the village, more faces appeared in windows and doorways, fishermen, shopkeepers, children peeking out from behind their parents' legs. They were all afraid, all except the boy standing before him. "Show me," Mihawk said simply. Without hesitation, Luffy lunged forward with a wild overhead swing that would have been laughably easy to avoid if it had been what it appeared to be. At the last second, the boy shifted his weight, pivoting on his back foot to turn the overhead strike into a diagonal slash aimed at Mihawk's legs. Interesting. The Shichibukai sidestepped the attack with minimal effort, but his golden eyes tracked every detail of the movement. The feint had been crude but effective, and the follow-up showed genuine tactical thinking. Someone had been teaching this boy, though not formally. Again, Mihawk commanded. Luffy didn't need to be told twice. This time he came in low, sweeping at Mihawk's ankles before immediately flowing into an upward thrust. When that was parried by Mihawk's casual hand movement, the boy spun away, maintaining distance and circling like a predator seeking an opening. Raw, undisciplined, but there was something there, a spark of instinct that couldn't be taught. "Loofe!" The sharp cry came from the direction of the village. A woman with orange hair and a worried expression came running down the path, followed by several concerned villagers. This had to be Makino, the one the boy had mentioned. "Luffy, get away from there," she called, slowing as she saw Mihawk's imposing figure. Recognition flickered across her features, followed by barely controlled terror. "Please, sir," she said, bowing deeply. "He's just a child. He doesn't understand." Her words were cut off by the sound of thundering hooves and rough laughter. From the mountain path came a group of men on horseback, bandits, judging by their ragged appearance and crude weapons. Their leader, a massive man with an axe slung across his back, spotted the gathering and grinned with predatory glee. Well, what do we have here?" The bandit chief's voice boomed across the harbor. "Looks like the little fishing village has some interesting visitors today." Mihawk's expression didn't change, but his eyes tracked the bandits with the casual interest of a hawk watching field mice. 17 men, all armed, approaching from the single mountain path that served as the village's main access route. Their positioning was sloppy, their formation amateur, but for simple villagers, they represented genuine danger. "Boss Higuma," Makino whispered, her voice tight with fear. "They come down from the mountain sometimes to take things." The bandits spread out as they reached the village outskirts, clearly preparing to surround the harbor area. Their leader's gaze fixed on Mihawk with a mixture of greed and caution. The man was clearly experienced enough to recognize danger when he saw it. "You there, stranger," Higuma called out, his hand resting on his axe handle. "This village is under our protection. That means you pay the toll, or you find yourself a new place to dock that fancy boat of yours." Mihawk said nothing, merely observing. The bandits were positioning themselves to cut off escape routes while keeping their leader safely back from any immediate threat. Standard tactics for small-time criminals preying on defenseless populations. What interested him more was the boy. Luffy had moved without conscious thought, positioning himself between the advancing bandits and Makino. His makeshift sword was raised, and despite being outnumbered 17-1, his stance showed no intention of backing down. "Leave them alone," Luffy shouted at the bandits. "These are good people, they haven't done anything wrong." Higuma's laughter was harsh and mocking. "Look at this, boys, the village has a little protector." He dismounted from his horse, his massive frame making even Mihawk look merely tall rather than towering. "Tell you what, kid, you put down that stick and walk away, and maybe I won't hurt your friends too badly." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a cannon blast. Around the harbor, villagers pressed themselves against buildings and behind carts, clearly torn between fleeing and staying to witness what would happen to their young defender. Luffy's response was to adjust his grip on the driftwood sword and take another step forward. "I said leave them alone." The change in his voice caught Mihawk's attention immediately. Gone was the childish bravado and simple declarations. This was something else entirely, a cold, calculating tone that belonged to someone much older and far more dangerous. Where did a 7-year-old learn to sound like that? "You've got some guts, kid," Higuma admitted, drawing his axe with a metallic scrape. "Too bad guts don't stop steel." What happened next would be burned into the memory of every witness for the rest of their lives. Luffy didn't charge recklessly forward as his earlier attacks on Mihawk might have suggested. Instead, he circled wide, moving with surprising speed to put one of the wooden dock posts between himself and Higuma's axe. When the bandit leader swung, the heavy blade bit deep into the wood, sticking fast for just a moment. In that instant, Luffy struck. The driftwood sword came up under Higuma's guard, the blunt tip slamming into the man's solar plexus with enough force to double him over. Before the bandit could recover, Luffy had already moved again, his small size allowing him to slip between two other attackers and strike at their knees with precise, disabling blows. He's hurting them, Mihawk realized with growing fascination. Using their size against them, forcing them to bunch up where they can't use their numerical advantage. It was brilliant tactical thinking and completely doomed. 17 bandits were still 17 bandits, no matter how cleverly a child moved. Within moments, Luffy found himself surrounded, his breath coming in sharp gasps, the driftwood sword cracked from repeated impacts against steel weapons. "End of the line, little hero," Higuma wheezed, having recovered enough to raise his axe again. You fought well, but this is the real world. Children don't get to play hero here. The axe began its descent toward the small boy's head, and stopped, caught between two fingers as easily as a falling leaf. Mihawk stood behind the bandit leader, having moved so quickly that none of the assembled criminals had even seen him approach. His golden eyes were cold, fixed on Higuma's terrified face with the kind of attention usually reserved for insects. "You are correct," the world's strongest swordsman said quietly. "This is the real world. And in the real world, there are consequences for threatening those under my protection." Under his protection, the words surprised even Mihawk himself. When had he made that decision? The answer came as he looked down at the small boy who had just displayed more courage and tactical awareness than most seasoned pirates. Luffy was staring up at him with wide eyes, but not the fear or awe Mihawk usually inspired. Instead, there was curiosity, gratitude, and something that looked suspiciously like recognition. "You're really strong," Luffy said simply. "Way stronger than me." "Yes," Mihawk replied, crushing Higuma's axe between his fingers as casually as breaking a twig. "I am? Will you teach me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, 16 remaining bandits stood frozen in terror, their leader unconscious at Mihawk's feet, their world suddenly and irrevocably changed by the presence of one of the most dangerous men alive. But all of that faded to background noise as Mihawk found himself truly seeing the boy before him for the first time. 7 years old, armed with a broken piece of driftwood, having just faced down 17 adult criminals to protect people he cared about. The tactical thinking, the fearless spirit, the instinctive understanding of combat dynamics, it all pointed to something extraordinary. Raw potential on a scale Mihawk had rarely encountered. "What is your name, boy?" "Monkey D. Luffy." The declaration came with a gap-toothed grin that somehow made the simple name sound like a battle cry. "I'm gonna be the strongest person in the world someday, Monkey D." The name resonated with half-remembered bounty posters and marine reports. There had been someone with that initial. Someone important enough that even a Shichibukai would have heard of them. Before Mihawk could pursue that thought further, the sound of approaching boots announced new arrivals. The Marines came up the harbor path at double time, led by a figure that made even Mihawk raise an eyebrow in surprise. Vice Admiral Monkey D. Garp, hero of the Marines, stopped short when he saw the scene before him. His grandson standing protectively in front of cowering villagers, a pile of unconscious bandits, and Dracule Mihawk casually dusting wood splinters from his fingers. "Hawkeyes," Garp said carefully, his usual boisterous demeanor notably absent. "Fancy meeting you here." "Garp." Mihawk's acknowledgement was equally measured. The history between Marine Hero and Shichibukai was complex, respectful enemies who had crossed paths many times over the years without ever truly clashing. Grandpa, Luffy's excitement was immediate and infectious as he ran toward the Marine officer. "Did you see? I protected the village, and this really strong guy helped me. He's even stronger than you." The casual assessment of relative power levels might have been insulting coming from anyone else. From 7-year-old Luffy, it was simply honest observation. Garp's eyes flicked between his grandson and the world's strongest swordsman, clearly processing the implications of their interaction. "Luffy, what exactly happened here?" As the boy launched into an animated retelling of the encounter, Mihawk found himself studying the family resemblance. The same fearless eyes, the same instinctive understanding of combat, the same absolute certainty in their own convictions. But where Garp's strength was purely physical, the boy showed signs of something more subtle, a strategic mind that could turn disadvantages into weapons. "He asked me to teach him," Mihawk said quietly, interrupting Luffy's enthusiastic narrative. The harbor fell silent. Even the boy stopped talking, sensing the weight of the moment. And Garp's voice was carefully neutral, but his fist was clenched at his side. Mihawk looked down at Luffy, who was watching the exchange with bright, curious eyes, 7 years old. Untrained but not untaught, someone had been working with the boy, giving him basics that showed in his movement and tactical thinking. The potential was there, raw and brilliant and waiting to be shaped. "The boy has talent," Mihawk said finally. "More than talent, he has the will to stand against impossible odds and the mind to make victory possible even when victory should be impossible." He paused, weighing his words carefully. "I believe he could become something extraordinary. He's going to be a Marine," Garp said firmly, "just like his grandfather." "No," Luffy's protest was immediate and absolute. "I'm gonna be a pirate. I'm gonna sail the seas and have adventures and become the strongest person ever." The declaration hit both men like a physical blow. Garp's face flushed red with frustration and embarrassment, while Mihawk's expression remained carefully neutral. "Luffy," Garp growled, "we've talked about this. But pirates are cool," the boy insisted. "They're free to go wherever they want and do whatever they want, and if I'm gonna be the strongest person ever, I need to learn from someone who's already really strong." His gaze shifted to Mihawk with an intensity that belied his age. "Please teach me. I'll work really hard, I promise. I won't give up no matter how tough it gets." The sincerity in those words was absolute. This wasn't childish whimsy or momentary hero worship. This was a life-changing decision being made with the kind of certainty most adults never achieved. Mihawk found himself at a crossroads he'd never expected to encounter. His life had been one of solitary pursuit of perfection, challenging the strong and dismissing the weak. He had never taken students, never shared his knowledge, never allowed anyone close enough to matter. But this boy, this strange, fearless, tactically brilliant child who would charge into battle against impossible odds to protect others. "The training would be harsh," Mihawk said slowly. "Harder than anything you can imagine. I do not coddle students or accept excuses. If you wish to learn from me, you will eat, sleep, and breathe the way of the sword until it becomes as natural as breathing." Luffy's grin could have lit up the entire harbor. "I can do that, I'm really tough, and I eat lots, so that part sounds great." Despite himself, Mihawk felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "Garp." His attention shifted to the marine hero. "I assume you have objections." The older man was quiet for a long moment, studying his grandson's determined face. Finally, he sighed, the sound of a man surrendering to the inevitable. "He's going to do what he's going to do," Garp said heavily. "At least with you, he'll learn discipline. And maybe, Mihawk prompted, maybe strong enough to survive the path he's choosing." The weight of that statement settled over the harbor like a physical presence. In agreeing to this arrangement, they weren't just talking about sword lessons or basic training. They were setting in motion events that would reshape the very foundations of the world. Mihawk extended his hand toward the boy. "Very well, Monkey D. Luffy. I will teach you to wield a blade. But know this, once we begin, there is no turning back. You will become strong, or you will be broken in the attempt." Luffy reached out without hesitation, his small hand disappearing into Mihawk's massive grip. "I won't break," he said with absolute conviction. "I promise my friends I become strong enough to protect everyone I care about, and I never break my promises." As their hands clasped, sealing a partnership that would echo across the seas for years to come, the morning mist finally began to clear from Foosha Village. The sun broke through the clouds, casting everything in sharp, brilliant light. In that moment, the future changed forever. The first thing Luffy noticed about Kuraigana Island wasn't the Gothic architecture of Mihawk's castle or the perpetual gloom that seemed to hang over the landscape like a funeral shroud. It wasn't even the eerie silence that made every footstep echo like thunder across the barren courtyards. It was the eyes, hundreds of them, watching from the shadows of ruined buildings and twisted trees. Red, intelligent, and unmistakably hostile. The human drills, baboon-like creatures that had learned to wield weapons by observing human swordsmen, tracked every movement as Mihawk led his new student through the island's desolate paths. "They will try to kill you," Mihawk said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Repeatedly, consider it part of your education." Luffy's response was characteristically enthusiastic. "Cool. Do they know any good sword moves?" The question actually made Mihawk pause mid-step. In his decades of dealing with aspiring swordsmen, wannabe challengers, and terrified marine recruits, no one had ever responded to mortal danger with curiosity about technique. Some, he admitted, they are skilled mimics. Every move they know was learned by watching others fight. "Then they must know some of your moves too, right?" Luffy's grin was practically blinding. "This is gonna be great training. What have I got myself into?" The thought flickered through Mihawk's mind as he watched his 7-year-old student practically bounce, with excitement at the prospect of facing creatures that had sent grown men fleeing in terror. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious in a deeply unsettling way. "First," Mihawk said firmly, "you will learn the basics: stance, grip, balance, breathing. Only when you have mastered these fundamentals will you be permitted to." His lecture was interrupted by a blood-curdling screech from overhead. One of the larger human drills had dropped from a gnarled tree branch, crude sword gleaming as it descended toward Luffy's head with predatory intent. Most children would have screamed. Some might have tried to run. A few brave souls might have raised their arms defensively. Luffy sidestepped the attack with fluid grace, letting the creature's momentum carry it past him before stepping in with a perfect counterstrike using the wooden practice sword Mihawk had given him. The blow caught the human drill in the ribs, sending it tumbling across the stone pathway with a pained grunt. "Like that?" Luffy asked, turning to his teacher with genuine curiosity. "I tried to use the breathing thing you mentioned on the boat." Mihawk stared at his student for a long moment. The attack, defense, and counter had all been executed with textbook precision. The timing was perfect, the form was sound, and the controlled breathing had indeed been exactly what Mihawk had been attempting to explain during their journey from East Blue. The problem was that he hadn't finished explaining it yet. How? The question came out sharper than Mihawk intended. "Oh," Luffy scratched the back of his head sheepishly. "Gramps taught me some stuff about fighting. He said breathing was really important for hitting hard and moving fast. And when you were talking about it, it sounded like the same thing but for swords instead of fists." Of course, Garp's training. That explained the tactical awareness, the fearless attitude, and the solid fundamental understanding of combat principles. The boy wasn't starting from nothing, he was adapting existing knowledge to a new weapon, which meant Mihawk's carefully planned curriculum was going to need significant revision. "Show me what else your grandfather taught you," he commanded. What followed was perhaps the most unusual lesson in the history of swordsmanship instruction. For the next hour, Luffy demonstrated a collection of techniques that were simultaneously crude and brilliant. Garp had clearly focused on practical application over formal training, teaching the boy to read opponents, exploit openings, and think several moves ahead without getting bogged down in rigid forms or traditional stances. It was exactly the wrong foundation for classical swordsmanship, and exactly the right foundation for becoming truly dangerous. "Adequate," Mihawk said finally, which from him was practically effusive praise. "We will build upon this. But first, you must understand the fundamental difference between fighting with fists and fighting with blades." He drew Yoru in one smooth motion, the massive black blade seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. With casual precision, he demonstrated a basic vertical cut, a movement so perfect it seemed to slice reality itself. "A fist strikes and withdraws," he explained, sheathing the legendary sword. "A blade extends your reach, your intent, your very will into the world. It becomes part of you, not merely a tool you wield." Luffy nodded seriously, absorbing every word with an intensity that was almost unsettling in someone so young. "Like how Gramps says Haki is using your spirit to make yourself stronger." Mihawk's hand froze halfway to Yoru's hilt. "What did you just say?" "Haki," Luffy repeated, tilting his head in confusion. "You know, the thing where you can hit really hard by wanting it really hard. Gramps showed me a little bit, but he said I was too young to learn it properly yet." Garp taught a 7-year-old the basics of Haki. The implications were staggering. Most Marines went their entire careers without even knowing such a thing existed, yet this child was casually discussing it as if it were as common as tying shoes. "Demonstrate," Mihawk ordered. Luffy's face scrunched up in concentration, his small hands gripping the practice sword with renewed focus. For several seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Then, gradually, the wooden blade began to take on a subtle sheen, not the metallic gleam of true armament Haki, but definitely the early stages of its development. The concentration required was clearly enormous. Sweat beaded on Luffy's forehead, and his breathing became labored within moments. But the fact that he could manifest even this rudimentary form of Haki at his age was impossible. Mihawk breathed. The sound of his voice broke Luffy's concentration, and the subtle enhancement faded immediately. The boy swayed slightly, exhausted by the effort. "I can only do it for a few seconds," Luffy admitted. "And it makes me really tired. Gramps said I'd get better when I got bigger and stronger." Mihawk found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about training timelines and human potential. Haki typically emerged naturally during moments of extreme stress or through years of dedicated training under expert instruction. For a child to demonstrate even basic proficiency suggested either incredible natural talent or exposure to techniques that should have been far beyond his comprehension. Possibly both. "We will incorporate Haki training into your sword work," Mihawk decided, "but gradually, the mind and body must develop together or both will suffer." The next several months fell into a routine that would have broken most adults, let alone a 7-year-old child. Dawn brought meditation and breathing exercises, designed to center the mind and prepare for the day's trials. Morning was dedicated to basic forms, the foundation movements that every swordsman needed to master before attempting anything more complex. Luffy's approach to these fundamentals was unique. Where traditional students would practice each form hundreds of times in isolation, Luffy insisted on understanding how they connected to each other. He would flow from one stance to another, creating impromptu combinations that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The forms are separate for a reason, Mihawk explained with strained patience during one particularly frustrating session. Each serves a specific purpose. Master them individually before attempting to combine them. But why? Luffy's question was accompanied by a demonstration of what he meant, a flowing sequence that transitioned from a defensive parry into an aggressive thrust, then spun into a wide horizontal slash that covered his retreat. They fit together like puzzle pieces. Look, the sequence was undeniably effective, even if it violated every principle of classical instruction. More importantly, it was uniquely suited to Luffy's size and natural movement patterns, turning potential disadvantages into tactical advantages. Against his better judgment, Mihawk found himself adapting his teaching methods to accommodate his students' unconventional learning style. Traditional forms became starting points rather than rigid requirements. Classical techniques were modified to work with Luffy's natural instincts rather than against them. It was heretical by every standard of proper swordsmanship instruction. It was also producing remarkable results. By the third month, Luffy could hold his own against the smaller human drills in brief skirmishes. His technique was still rough, his form unpolished, but his tactical awareness and adaptability were extraordinary. He learned to read his opponent's movements, anticipate their attacks, and turn their strength against them with increasing sophistication. The real breakthrough came on a humid afternoon in late summer when a routine training session was interrupted by an unexpected delivery. The merchant ship had been driven off course by a sudden storm, its captain grateful to find any safe harbor in the treacherous waters around Kuraigana Island. Among the supplies they offered in trade was a collection of exotic fruits from the Grand Line, rare delicacies that commanded high prices in more civilized waters. Luffy's eyes had locked onto one fruit in particular, a strange purple melon covered in swirling patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The merchant had been eager to part with it, claiming it tasted awful and had been causing nothing but trouble since they'd acquired it. "Don't eat that," Mihawk warned, recognizing the distinctive patterns immediately. "That appears to be a..." His warning came exactly 1 second too late. Luffy had already taken an enormous bite, his face immediately contorting in disgust. "Bleg, this tastes terrible, like rubber and soap had a baby." The transformation was instantaneous. Luffy's arm, still holding the half-eaten fruit, stretched impossibly as he tried to throw the offending object as far away as possible. Instead of releasing it normally, his hand snapped back like a rubber band, smacking him in the face with his own fist. For a moment, the courtyard was perfectly silent except for the sound of Luffy nursing his bruised nose. Did my arm just stretch?" he asked in wonder, extending the limb experimentally and watching it elongate like taffy. "You," Mihawk said with the careful tone of someone trying very hard not to lose his temper, "have just consumed a devil fruit. Specifically the Gamu Gamu no Mi, which has granted you the properties of rubber at the cost of your ability to swim." Luffy's response was characteristically enthusiastic. "Cool. Does this mean I'm like super bouncy now?" What followed was perhaps the most chaotic training session in the history of swordsmanship. Luffy, drunk on the possibilities of his new abilities, proceeded to experiment with every conceivable way rubber physics could be applied to sword combat. Most of his attempts were disasters. Stretching his arm to extend his reach threw off his balance completely. Trying to use his elasticity for faster strikes resulted in wild, uncontrolled swings that missed their targets by meters. An attempt to bounce off the ground for aerial attacks ended with him tangled in his own limbs. But some showed promise. "Interesting," Mihawk murmured as he watched Luffy successfully execute a technique the boy was already calling Gamu Gamu no Pistol, stretching his arm back before snapping it forward with devastating force. The principles remain the same, but the application... It was like watching someone reinvent swordsmanship from first principles. Every technique had to be reconsidered, every form adapted to account for abilities that no traditional instruction had ever contemplated. "This changes everything," Mihawk said finally. "In a good way or a bad way?" Luffy asked, still marveling at his stretchable fingers. "That," Mihawk replied, "remains to be seen." The following months were a period of intense experimentation and adaptation. Mihawk found himself developing entirely new training methods to accommodate his students' unique physiology. Traditional strength exercises were useless when dealing with rubber muscles that responded differently to tension and resistance. Balance training had to account for a body that could contort in ways that would cripple normal humans. Most challenging of all was weapon training. How do you teach proper sword grip to someone whose hands can stretch and compress at will? How do you maintain form when your students' arms can extend to 3 times their normal length mid-swing? The answers came gradually, through trial and error that would have been comical if it weren't so genuinely innovative. Luffy learned to use his stretching ability for extended reach while maintaining proper body mechanics through careful control of tension. His rubber properties allowed him to absorb impacts that would shatter normal bones, opening up aggressive fighting styles that would be suicidal for anyone else. But perhaps most importantly, he began developing techniques that no traditional swordsman could ever replicate. Gamu Gamu no, sword whip, Luffy announced proudly as he demonstrated his latest creation. By stretching his arm while maintaining a loose grip on his practice blade, he could create a flexible weapon that struck from unexpected angles while still maintaining enough control for precision work. Mihawk watched the demonstration with fascination and growing respect. The technique was completely unorthodox, violated every principle of classical swordsmanship, and was undeniably effective. More than that, it showed genuine creativity in adapting fundamental concepts to unique circumstances. The principle is sound, he admitted, but your control needs work. You're sacrificing precision for unpredictability. Can't I have both? Luffy asked with the kind of innocent optimism that had already gotten him into more trouble than most people faced in a lifetime. The question sparked weeks of intensive development. Luffy practiced constantly, working to maintain sword control even while his arms stretched to impossible lengths. Mihawk found himself developing new training exercises specifically designed to build the kind of flexibility and precision required for rubber-based swordplay. It was during one of these training sessions that they had their first serious philosophical discussion. "Why do you fight?" Mihawk asked as they took a break from a particularly intense drilling session. Luffy considered the question seriously, his usual enthusiasm replaced by thoughtful concentration. "To protect people I care about," he said finally, "and to become strong enough that nobody can hurt them. And if achieving that strength requires you to hurt others." The question hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. It was the fundamental question every swordsman had to answer, the choice between protection and destruction, between the sword that saves and the sword that kills. Luffy's answer came without hesitation. "Then I'll hurt them. But only if they're trying to hurt someone who doesn't deserve it. And who decides what someone deserves? I do." The simplicity of the response was matched by its absolute certainty. "If you're hurting people who can't protect themselves, then you're wrong, and I'll stop you." Mihawk studied his young student for a long moment. The boy's worldview was admirably clear-cut, refreshingly free from the moral complexities that plagued most adults. But that simplicity could be both strength and weakness. "The world is not always so clear," he warned. "Sometimes good people do terrible things for noble reasons. Sometimes villains believe they are heroes. Sometimes there is no right choice, only necessary ones." "Then I'll figure it out when it happens," Luffy replied with characteristic confidence, "but I won't let people get hurt if I can stop it." As winter settled over Kuraigana Island, Luffy's training intensified. The cold weather forced them indoors more often, leading to more focused work on meditation, breathing techniques, and the theoretical aspects of swordsmanship that Mihawk insisted were just as important as physical skill. It was during one of these indoor sessions that Luffy achieved his first major breakthrough in observation Haki. They had been working on awareness exercises, learning to sense movement and intent without relying on sight or sound. Mihawk had positioned several human drills around the room while Luffy sat blindfolded in the center, attempting to track their positions through pure instinct. "Feel their presence," Mihawk instructed. "Every living thing has a signature, a unique way it interacts with the world around it. Learn to recognize these signatures, and you will never be truly surprised in battle." For weeks, Luffy had struggled with the concept. His natural empathy helped him read emotions and intentions, but translating that into practical combat awareness was proving difficult. Then, without warning, something clicked. "There," Luffy said softly, pointing directly at a human drill that had been creeping silently toward his back. "And there's one above me, isn't there?" Mihawk's eyebrows rose in surprise. The boy's positioning was perfect, every creature in the room accurately located despite being completely unable to see or hear them. "How did you know about the one above you?" Mihawk asked. That particular human drill had been clinging silently to the ceiling, positioned where no normal senses could have detected it. "I could feel it wanting to drop on me," Luffy explained, pulling off his blindfold with a grin. like feeling someone staring at you but stronger, intent-based observation Haki. At 7 years old, Luffy had independently developed one of the most advanced applications of the ability, the power to sense not just presence, but hostile intent itself. Extraordinary, Mihawk breathed. The winter months that followed were marked by rapid advancement in all areas of Luffy's training. His swordsmanship evolved from crude but effective to genuinely sophisticated. His Haki abilities strengthened steadily, allowing him to sense attacks before they developed and land blows with supernatural precision. Most importantly, he began developing a fighting style that was uniquely his own, a fusion of Mihawk's disciplined precision with his natural creativity and rubber-enhanced capabilities. By spring, Luffy was ready for his first real test. The challenge came in the form of a pack of human drills that had been growing increasingly aggressive as the weather warmed. Led by a massive specimen that wielded a crude but effective copy of a famous swordsman's techniques, they had begun encroaching on the castle grounds themselves. 12 of them, Mihawk observed as they watched the creatures from the castle's main balcony. The leader is approximately equivalent to a trained marine lieutenant in skill level. The others vary, but all are dangerous. Can I fight them? Luffy asked eagerly. Mihawk considered the question seriously. The boy had made remarkable progress, but this would be his first real combat test since gaining his devil fruit abilities. The human drills were skilled opponents who would show no mercy, and 12-to-1 odds were significant even for someone with Luffy's growing abilities. On the other hand, Luffy would need to face such challenges eventually if he was ever to become truly strong. Better to do so under controlled circumstances, where Mihawk could intervene if necessary. Very well, he decided. But you will face them alone. This is your test, not mine. Luffy's grin was answer enough. The battle that followed was unlike anything the ancient island had witnessed in decades. Luffy moved through the pack of human drills like water flowing around stones, his rubber body allowing him to contort away from attacks that should have been impossible to avoid. His swordwork had evolved far beyond simple technique. He used his stretching abilities to create deceptive attack angles, striking from directions that conventional swordsmen couldn't reach. His observation Haki let him anticipate attacks before they fully developed, turning what should have been desperate dodges into flowing counters. But most impressively, he fought with a style that was purely his own. Neither Mihawk's precise efficiency nor Garp's overwhelming force, but something new that combined elements of both while remaining uniquely suited to his personality and abilities. "Gamu Gamu no, Sword Storm," Luffy called out as he spun in place, his stretched arms creating a whirling barrier of steel that forced the human drills back while simultaneously striking any that came too close. When the dust settled, 11 human drills lay unconscious around the courtyard. The leader stood alone, bleeding from multiple wounds but still defiant. For a moment, boy and beast faced each other across the stone courtyard. Then, to Mihawk's surprise, Luffy lowered his sword. "You fought really well," he told the massive creature with genuine respect. "But this is my home now, and I won't let you hurt the people I care about. You can stay if you want to be friends, but no more fighting unless we're training." The human drill stared at him for a long moment, then slowly lowered its own weapon. With a grunt that might have been acknowledgement, it began tending to its fallen pack members. Mihawk watched this exchange with growing amazement. The boy had not only defeated 12 dangerous opponents, but had done so while maintaining his essential nature, fighting to protect rather than destroy, seeking understanding rather than dominance. "Well done," he said as Luffy approached, breathing hard but grinning with satisfaction. "Your technique has improved considerably." "Thanks," Luffy beamed at the praise, then looked back at the human drills who were slowly recovering from their defeat. "Do you think they'll want to train with us now?" The question perfectly encapsulated everything that made Luffy unique. Where most people would see defeated enemies, he saw potential friends and training partners. Where others would demand submission, he offered cooperation. "Perhaps," Mihawk replied, though privately he suspected the boy was right. There was something about Luffy that seemed to inspire loyalty even in those he defeated. As they walked back toward the castle, Mihawk reflected on the remarkable transformation that had taken place over the past year. The eager but undisciplined child who had first arrived on Kuraigana Island had evolved into something genuinely extraordinary, a fighter who combined physical ability with tactical intelligence, power with compassion, discipline with creativity. But perhaps most importantly, he had done so while remaining fundamentally himself. The training had refined and focused his natural abilities rather than replacing them with something artificial. "What's next?" Luffy asked as they reached the castle's main entrance. Mihawk paused at the question, considering the many paths that lay ahead. Advanced techniques, deeper Haki training, exposure to different fighting styles, preparation for the wider world. Next, he said finally, we begin preparing you for the Grand Line. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by one of the news coups that had learned to navigate the treacherous waters around Kuraigana Island. Mihawk read it while sipping his morning coffee, his expression unchanging even as the contents revealed information that would have surprised most people. Your grandfather wishes to see you, he announced to Luffy, who was in the middle of his morning forms. There's been an incident involving your brother. Luffy's practice sword stopped mid-swing. In the 3 years since he'd come to live with Mihawk, mentions of his family had been rare. Garp visited occasionally, always with thinly veiled concern about Luffy's progress and pointed questions about whether the boy was developing proper marine values. These visits invariably ended with heated discussions between the marine hero and the world's strongest swordsman, while Luffy demonstrated increasingly sophisticated techniques that made his grandfather's eye twitch. But Ace was different. Ace was the brother Luffy remembered laughing with, training with, planning impossible adventures with during long summer afternoons in the Goa Kingdom forests. What kind of incident? Luffy asked, and Mihawk noted how the boy's voice had changed over the years. Still enthusiastic, still fundamentally optimistic, but tempered now with the kind of measured caution that came from real training and real understanding of consequences. He's been arrested, Mihawk replied simply. Apparently, he set fire to several marine vessels and caused significant damage to a naval installation. Your grandfather is. Displeased, Luffy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. The old Luffy might have immediately declared his intention to break Ace out of prison. The new Luffy, trained by 3 years under Mihawk's tutelage, considered the situation more carefully. Is he okay? Was what he finally asked. Physically, yes. Politically, the situation is complicated. Mihawk set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. Your grandfather has requested that you visit. I believe he hopes your development will prove instructive to your brother. The journey to Goa Kingdom took 2 days by Mihawk's coffin boat, during which Luffy spent most of his time practicing meditation and advanced sword forms. Mihawk observed his student's preparation with approval. The boy had learned to use travel time constructively, maintaining his training regimen regardless of circumstances. But he also noticed the tension in Luffy's movements. The way his usual relaxed confidence had been replaced by something more focused and sharp-edged. The prospect of seeing his brother again after 3 years of separation was clearly affecting him more than he wanted to admit. You're worried, Mihawk observed as they approached Dawn Island's familiar coastline. A little, Luffy admitted, not breaking his concentration as he flowed through a complex sequence of stretching sword techniques. What if he's different? What if I'm different? What if we don't? What if you've both grown? Mihawk suggested gently. Growth is not betrayal of who you once were, it is becoming who you were always meant to be. The philosophy was classic Mihawk, profound, slightly cryptic, and ultimately practical. Luffy nodded, though his expression suggested he was still working through the implications. Garp was waiting for them at the harbor, his usual boisterous demeanor notably absent. The marine hero looked older than Mihawk remembered, with new lines around his eyes and a heaviness to his posture that spoke of recent troubles. Luffy, he said, and his voice carried a mixture of pride and concern that had become familiar over the years. You've grown, it was true. At 10 years old, Luffy was still small for his age, but his frame had filled out with the kind of lean muscle that came from constant physical training. More importantly, he carried himself differently, with the balanced confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous he was and exactly how much control he had over that danger. Hi, Grandpa, Luffy replied, and if his smile was a bit more restrained than it used to be, it was no less genuine. Where's Ace? Locked up in Goa Town's marine station, Garp said grimly. Little bastard won't talk to anyone except to demand they let him go so he can finish what he started. The marine hero's expression softened slightly. Maybe he'll listen to you. The walk to town was conducted in relative silence, with Mihawk and Garp maintaining the kind of wary respect that had developed between them over the years. Luffy walked between them, his eyes tracking everything around them with the constant awareness that had become second nature. Your observation Haki has improved considerably, Mihawk noted, observing how Luffy's attention shifted to track potential threats that hadn't even materialized yet. The island's full of interesting people, Luffy replied diplomatically. Lots of different feelings. What he didn't say, but what Mihawk understood, was that Luffy's empathic abilities had developed to the point where he could sense not just hostile intent, but the full spectrum of human emotion in everyone around them. The political tensions, class resentments, and social inequalities of Goa Kingdom were as visible to him now as physical objects. The Marine Station was a modest building near the town center, built more for processing paperwork than holding dangerous criminals. Ace was being kept in a cell that was really more of a reinforced storage room, though the bars on the windows and guards at the door made its purpose clear enough. 10 minutes, Garp told Luffy. And if he gives you any trouble, he won't, Luffy said with quiet confidence. The moment Luffy entered the cell area, he could feel Ace's presence like a bonfire, bright, intense, and barely contained. His brother was pacing the small space like a caged animal, radiating frustration and barely suppressed rage. Then Ace saw him and everything stopped. Luffy? Ace's voice was uncertain, almost vulnerable in a way that Luffy remembered from their childhood. Is that really you? Hey, Ace. Luffy's smile was warm and genuine, though his posture remained carefully balanced. You look taller. For a moment, the brothers simply stared at each other across the iron bars. 3 years was a long time when you're that age, long enough for voices to change, faces to mature, and entire worldviews to shift. You look. Ace started, then stopped, clearly struggling to put his observations into words. Different. Stronger, more, I don't know, serious. Training does that, Luffy said simply. Are you okay? Gramps said you've been causing trouble. Ace's expression immediately darkened. Those bastards had it coming. They were talking about expanding the marine presence in the Gray Terminal, cleaning up the criminal element. You know what that means? Luffy did know. It meant displacing the people who lived there, people who had nowhere else to go, people whose only crime was being too poor to afford better. The kind of people Luffy had learned to protect during his years of training. What did you do? He asked quietly. Set fire to 3 of their ships and planted explosives in their supply warehouse, Ace replied with defiant pride. Would have gotten their barracks too if some asshole hadn't sounded the alarm. The old Luffy would have been impressed by the audacity and scale of the destruction. The new Luffy found himself analyzing the tactical implications, the planning required, the timing, the risks to civilians, the political consequences. Did anyone get hurt? He asked. Ace's defiance faltered slightly. A few Marines got some burns, nothing serious. I made sure the ships were mostly empty before I lit them up. He planned it out, Luffy realized. He wasn't just lashing out, he was trying to send a message while minimizing casualties. It was simultaneously more and less than he'd expected from his hot-headed brother. And now, Luffy asked, what's your plan for getting out of here? Don't need a plan, Ace said, though his tone suggested he absolutely did need a plan and knew it. Soon as they transfer me to a real prison, I'll break out and disappear into the Grand Line. Or, Luffy said carefully, you could let Gramps arrange something. Community service, maybe, work off the damages. Ace stared at him in shock. Since when do you care about working with Marines? Since I learned that sometimes the best way to protect people is to work within the system instead of fighting it. Luffy's voice carried a weight of experience that seemed impossible from someone so young. You want to help the people in Gray Terminal, fine, but burning ships just pisses off the Marines without actually solving anything. And what would you do? Ace challenged. Mr. Perfect Student with his fancy sword training. The words stung, partly because there was truth in them. Luffy had changed during his time with Mihawk, had become more disciplined, more thoughtful, more strategic in his approach to problems. But those changes had come with costs, distances from his old self that sometimes felt like losses. I don't know, Luffy admitted honestly, but I'd try to find a way that didn't end with good people getting hurt. They talked for the remaining minutes about safer topics, Ace's adventures in the mountains, Luffy's training progress, shared memories from their childhood that felt both recent and impossibly distant. When the time came for Luffy to leave, both brothers seemed reluctant to end the conversation. Take care of yourself, Ace said finally, and don't let all that training turn you into someone I don't recognize. I'm still me, Luffy promised. Just better at protecting people I care about. The resolution of Ace's legal troubles took several days of negotiation between Garp, local officials, and various political interests. During that time, Luffy found himself exploring the parts of Goa Kingdom he'd never been allowed to visit during his childhood, particularly the Gray Terminal, where the kingdom's unwanted people scraped out whatever living they could among the refuse and discarded goods. What he found there would shape his understanding of justice for the rest of his life. The Gray Terminal wasn't just a slum, it was a deliberate creation, a place where the kingdom could dump its problems and pretend they didn't exist. Families lived in makeshift shelters built from garbage and scrap metal. Children who should have been in school instead spent their days scavenging for anything useful enough to trade for food. And yet, despite the poverty and hardship, Luffy found genuine community there. People looked out for each other, shared what little they had, protected their neighbors' children as fiercely as their own. It was during one of these visits that he met Sabo. The boy was about Ace's age, though it was hard to tell under the layers of grime and carefully maintained camouflage that marked him as a gray terminal resident. What caught Luffy's attention wasn't his appearance, it was the way he moved, with the kind of fluid grace that suggested either natural talent or serious training. "You're not from here," Sabo observed, watching Luffy navigate the treacherous pathways between makeshift dwellings with too much ease. "Too clean, too well-fed, but you're not scared either, which means you're either stupid or dangerous." "Maybe both," Luffy replied cheerfully. "I'm Luffy, who are you?" "Sabo." The introduction came with a wary pause. "And you're the one who's been visiting that marine prisoner. Word gets around fast in a place like this." Luffy nodded, unsurprised that news of his connection to Ace had spread through the terminal's informal communication networks. "He's my brother, well, sort of. We're not blood-related, but family's more than blood," Sabo finished, and something in his voice suggested personal experience with that truth. "Yeah, I get it." They talked as Luffy continued his exploration, with Sabo serving as guide through the labyrinthine social and physical geography of the terminal. The boy was intelligent, well-spoken despite his rough appearance, and possessed of a cynical wisdom that seemed far too mature for his age. "You want to know the real crime?" Sabo asked as they watched a group of children playing with toys made from scraps of metal and cloth. "It's not that these people are poor, it's that they're invisible. The nobles up in High Town pretend this place doesn't exist, even though they're trash and their policies created it." Luffy absorbed this observation in thoughtful silence. His training with Mihawk had taught him to see beyond surface appearances, to understand the deeper currents that shaped human behavior. Applied to the gray terminal, those lessons painted a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than simple poverty. "What would you do about it?" he asked. Sabo's laugh was bitter. "Me, I'm nobody. I'm not even supposed to exist. But if I could..." He paused, staring out at the sprawling settlement with an expression that mixed determination with desperate hope. "I'd make sure everyone could see this place. I'd drag every noble and every marine official down here and make them look at what their decisions actually cost." It was a noble sentiment, and one that resonated with everything Mihawk had taught Luffy about the responsibility that came with strength. But it was also naive in the way that only someone who'd never held real power could be naive. "And then what?" Luffy pressed gently. "After you make them look," Sabo's expression faltered slightly. Then they'd have to do something about it. Right, people aren't really evil, they just don't understand." The faith in basic human decency was touching and probably doomed. But Luffy found himself liking this strange, idealistic boy who believed that understanding could overcome entrenched interests and political convenience. "Maybe," he said diplomatically. "Or maybe they'd find ways to not see it anyway." "You're pretty cynical for someone who looks like he's never missed a meal," Sabo observed. "My teacher says that understanding how the world works doesn't mean you have to accept it," Luffy replied. "But you have to understand it before you can change it." Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Ace, finally released from marine custody and looking for his brother. The meeting between Ace and Sabo was immediate and electric, two strong personalities recognizing something kindred in each other. "So you're the famous brother," Sabo said, looking Ace up and down appraisingly. "You're smaller than I expected, and you're dirtier than I expected," Ace shot back, though there was no real hostility in it. "Luffy says you've been showing him around this place. Someone has to. Can't have tourists wandering around getting themselves killed." What followed was an impromptu contest of strength, skill, and stubbornness as the two boys sized each other up through increasingly elaborate challenges. Luffy watched with amusement as they progressed from arm wrestling to sparring to seeing who could balance longest on a precarious pile of scrap metal. By the end of the afternoon, they were fast friends. "We should be brothers," Sabo declared as the three of them sat sharing a simple meal of fish and rice that Luffy had provided. "All three of us, not just by blood, but by choice." The proposal was made with the kind of serious intensity that only children could bring to their most important decisions. Ace and Luffy exchanged glances, both recognizing the weight of what was being offered. "Brothers," Ace agreed solemnly. "Brothers," Luffy confirmed. The oath they swore that evening was simple but profound. To protect each other, to never abandon each other, to be family regardless of what blood or circumstances might dictate. They sealed it by sharing cups of sake that Sabo had somehow acquired, though Luffy's enhanced constitution meant the alcohol had virtually no effect on him. What mattered wasn't the ritual itself, but the commitment it represented. 3 boys from completely different backgrounds, choosing to bind their fates together through nothing more than shared determination and mutual affection. For Luffy, it represented something he hadn't realized he'd been missing during his years of training with Mihawk: the simple joy of companionship with people his own age. People who saw him as just Luffy rather than as a student or project or responsibility. The summer that followed was perhaps the happiest of Luffy's life up to that point. Days were split between intensive training sessions with Mihawk and adventures with his newly sworn brothers. Ace and Sabo proved surprisingly willing to incorporate some structure and discipline into their own training, inspired by the obvious results of Luffy's regimen. "Show us that stretchy sword thing again," Ace would demand, watching in fascination as Luffy demonstrated techniques that seemed to violate every law of physics and swordsmanship. "It's all about maintaining control while extending reach," Luffy explained, stretching his arm to twice its normal length while keeping his grip firm and his blade steady. "If you lose control of the weapon, it doesn't matter how far you can reach." Under Luffy's patient instruction, both boys began developing their own fighting styles with greater sophistication. Ace's natural aggression became more focused and strategic. Sabo's intelligence translated into tactical awareness that complemented his natural agility. Most importantly, the 3 brothers learned to fight together, covering each other's weaknesses, coordinating attacks, developing the kind of seamless cooperation that came from absolute trust. It was during one of these training sessions that disaster struck. The fire started in High Town, according to the official reports. An accident involving oil lamps and silk curtains that spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. But Luffy's enhanced senses told a different story: the acrid smell of accelerants, the too regular pattern of ignition points, the way the flames seemed to follow paths that would drive people toward specific escape routes. This was arson, planned and executed with deadly precision. "We have to help," Sabo said immediately upon seeing the smoke rising from the direction of town. "There are people in those buildings." "The Marines will handle it," Ace protested, though his expression suggested he didn't really believe it. Luffy was already moving, his observation Haki stretching out to assess the situation. What he sensed made his blood run cold, not just the fire, but the intentional nature of it, the way certain areas were being allowed to burn while others were being protected by strategically placed fire breaks. "It's not an accident," he said grimly. "Someone's using the fire to clear out areas they want emptied." The implications hit all 3 boys simultaneously. The gray terminal, with its inflammable shelters and narrow escape routes, would be a death trap if the fire reached it. They ran. The scene that greeted them at the terminal was chaos incarnate. Flames were already licking at the outer edges of the settlement, driven by winds that seemed almost too conveniently directed. Residents were fleeing in panic, carrying what possessions they could while abandoning everything else. But some areas were already cut off, with families trapped by walls of flame that moved too fast and burned too hot to be natural. There, Sabo pointed to a cluster of shelters where smoke and screaming indicated trapped people. "We have to get them out." Without hesitation, all 3 brothers plunged into the inferno. What followed was perhaps the most intense hour of Luffy's young life. His training with Mihawk had prepared him for many things, but navigating a deliberately set fire while rescuing civilians pushed every skill he developed to its absolute limit. His devil fruit powers proved invaluable. Rubber didn't burn as easily as flesh, allowing him to push through flames that would have been lethal to normal humans. His stretching abilities let him reach people trapped in collapsed shelters, pulling them to safety from impossible angles. But it was his observation Haki that made the real difference. The ability to sense people's locations even through smoke and flame, to anticipate structural collapses before they happened, to find safe paths through the chaos. These were the skills that turned a rescue operation from impossible to merely incredibly dangerous. Ace and Sabo fought beside him with desperate courage, using their own skills to create fire breaks and evacuation routes. They saved dozens of people that night, families who would have died if not for their intervention. But they couldn't save everyone. The trap, when it was sprung, was elegant in its simplicity. The fire had been allowed to spread in a specific pattern, herding evacuees toward a single escape route that led through High Town. But when the refugees reached that route, they found it blocked by Marines who claimed to be maintaining order and processing evacuees for their own safety. The processing involved separating families, confiscating what few valuables people had managed to save, and directing different groups to different locations based on criteria that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with the political usefulness of who lived where. Sabo saw at first the systematic nature of what was happening, the way certain people were being directed toward temporary shelters that looked suspiciously permanent, the way others were being loaded onto ships with destinations that nobody would discuss. "They're not rescuing people," he said, horror and rage warring in his voice. "They're using the fire as an excuse to relocate anyone they don't want in the kingdom anymore." "That's impossible," Ace protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Luffy's observation Haki was already confirming what Sabo had deduced. The emotions he sensed from the Marine officers weren't panic or urgency. They were calculation, satisfaction, and in some cases, outright greed as valuable items were quietly diverted from their rightful owners. "We have to stop this," Sabo declared, and Luffy could see the moment when idealism crystallized into determination. "How?" Ace demanded. "There's dozens of them and they're Marines. We're just 3 kids." But Sabo was already moving, driven by a fury that transcended tactical considerations. He charged toward the Marine checkpoint, shouting about injustice and demanding answers that nobody was prepared to give. Luffy's enhanced senses caught the danger a split second before it materialized. A Marine officer with a pistol, tracking Sabo's approach, finger tightening on the trigger with cold deliberation. Time seemed to slow as Luffy's body reacted faster than conscious thought. His arms stretched out impossibly far, crossing the distance between himself and Sabo in the blink of an eye. But even with his devil fruit abilities, even with his enhanced speed and reflexes, he was a fraction of a second too late to prevent the shot entirely. The bullet that would have killed Sabo instead caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling into a pile of debris that had been stacked conveniently close to the harbor. What happened next was chaos of a different kind. The debris turned out to be barrels of lamp oil and accelerants, the materials that had been used to start and direct the fire. The impact of Sabo's fall ruptured several containers, creating a pool of volatile liquid that ignited instantly when touched by wind-blown sparks. The explosion was visible from miles away. When the flames finally died down enough for search parties to investigate, they found no trace of Sabo's body. The official report would list him as a casualty of the fire, one of the unfortunate victims of a tragic accident that had claimed so many innocent lives. Luffy and Ace knew better. They had felt the moment when Sabo's presence simply ended, snuffed out like a candle in the wind. There was no uncertainty, no hope for miraculous survival. Their brother was gone. The aftermath was a blur of grief, rage, and official investigations that concluded exactly what they were supposed to conclude. The fire was ruled accidental. The Marine response was praised for its efficiency under difficult circumstances. The displacement and relocation of Grey Terminal residents was framed as humanitarian aid rather than social engineering. Nobody asked uncomfortable questions about the convenient timing, the suspicious burn patterns, or the remarkable efficiency with which certain political problems had been solved by natural disaster. Ace wanted blood. He raged about hunting down everyone responsible, about making them pay for what they'd done, about burning down the entire system that had allowed such injustice to flourish. Luffy wanted the same things, with an intensity that frightened him. The training Mihawk had given him included techniques that could have turned his grief and anger into weapons capable of carving through Marine ranks like wheat before a scythe. But when Ace demanded that they act on these impulses immediately, Luffy found himself hesitating. "What would Sabo want us to do?" he asked during one of their planning sessions for a revenge strike against the officials they'd identified as responsible. "He'd want justice," Ace replied without hesitation. "Would he?" Luffy pressed. "Or would he want us to make sure this never happens to anyone else?" The question sparked the biggest fight the brothers had ever had, a vicious argument that touched on everything from their shared grief to their different approaches to problem-solving. Ace accused Luffy of being cold, of caring more about abstract philosophy than their dead brother. Luffy accused Ace of letting his emotions cloud his judgment, of wanting revenge more than actual solutions. They didn't speak for 3 days. The reconciliation came when both boys realized they were arguing about methods, not goals. They both wanted justice for Sabo and protection for the innocent people who remained vulnerable to similar schemes. They just disagreed about how to achieve those objectives. Promise me something, Ace said as they sat together at the place where they'd first sworn their brotherhood oath. Promise me you won't let all that training make you forget how to feel things. Don't become so focused on being strategic that you stop caring about people. It was a fair concern. Luffy's time with Mihawk had indeed taught him to think before acting, to consider consequences and long-term implications. But it had also created a certain emotional distance that hadn't existed before, a tendency to analyze situations rather than simply react to them. I promise, Luffy said solemnly, but you have to promise me something too. Promise you won't let your anger make you stupid. Sabo died because the system is broken, not because individual people are evil. If we want to fix it, we have to be smarter than the people who broke it. I promise, Ace replied, though his expression suggested the promise would be harder for him to keep. The brothers spent Luffy's remaining time in Goa Kingdom working through their grief by throwing themselves into training with unprecedented intensity. Luffy shared advanced techniques that Mihawk had taught him, while Ace pushed his natural abilities to new limits through pure determination and fury. But the real breakthrough came when they began developing combination techniques, attacks that leveraged both their individual strengths and their deep understanding of each other's fighting styles. Gamu Gamu no, Luffy would begin. Fire Fist, Ace would continue. Combo Attack, they would finish together, as Luffy's stretching punch carried Ace's flames across impossible distances or Ace's fire provided propulsion for Luffy's aerial techniques. The development of these combination attacks required perfect timing, absolute trust, and a level of coordination that bordered on telepathic. They were also devastatingly effective, capable of overwhelming opponents who could handle either brother individually. By the time Luffy's visit neared its end, both boys had evolved considerably as fighters and as people. Ace had learned to channel his anger into focused determination rather than reckless rage. Luffy had learned to balance strategic thinking with emotional engagement, to be smart without becoming cold. Most importantly, they had processed their grief over Sabo's death in a way that honored his memory while preparing them for the challenges ahead. Take care of yourself, Ace said as they prepared to part ways again, and when we meet again, I want to see that you've gotten even stronger. You too, Luffy replied, and Ace. When you become a pirate, be the kind of pirate Sabo would have been proud of. The words carried weight that both brothers understood. Not just a pirate who was strong or successful, but one who used that strength to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The return journey to Kuraigana Island was conducted in thoughtful silence. Mihawk could see that his student had been profoundly affected by recent events, though the exact nature of those changes remained unclear. You lost someone, Mihawk observed as they sailed through the calm evening waters. My brother, Luffy confirmed quietly. Not Ace, another one. His name was Sabo. Mihawk waited patiently for elaboration, understanding that grief couldn't be rushed or forced into convenient explanations. He wanted to make the world better, Luffy continued eventually. He believed that if you could just make people see injustice clearly enough, they'd have to do something about it. And now you know better. Now I know that seeing isn't enough. Luffy's voice carried a weight of experience that seemed impossible from someone so young. People can see injustice and choose to ignore it if fixing it would be inconvenient or expensive. Understanding the problem isn't the same as solving it. The insight was sophisticated, painful, and absolutely correct. Mihawk felt a mixture of pride and sadness, pride that his student was developing genuine wisdom, sadness that such wisdom had come at such a terrible cost. What will you do with this understanding? He asked. Luffy was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening horizon. I'm going to get strong enough that nobody can ignore me when I tell them to stop hurting people, he said finally. And I'm going to learn how to use that strength to actually fix things, not just break them. It was perhaps the most mature statement Mihawk had ever heard from his young student. It also represented a fundamental evolution in Luffy's understanding of what strength truly meant, not just the power to win fights, but the ability to create lasting change in the world. Over the following years, that understanding would transform Luffy's training from the acquisition of individual techniques into the development of a comprehensive philosophy of power and responsibility. Mihawk began introducing concepts that he had previously considered too advanced. The relationship between personal strength and political influence, the ways that individual actions could create systemic changes, the careful balance between inspiring fear and inspiring loyalty. But perhaps most importantly, they began developing techniques that could serve both combat and non-combat purposes. Swordsmanship that could disable rather than kill. Haki applications that could compel attention rather than simply overwhelm opposition. Strategies that could protect the innocent while neutralizing threats. By age 14, Luffy had evolved into something genuinely unprecedented. A fighter who combined world-class technique with rubber-enhanced capabilities, advanced Haki with tactical intelligence, and overwhelming personal charisma with mature understanding of complex moral situations. The final test of this development came in the form of a pirate crew that had the misfortune to threaten the Daden family while Luffy was visiting. The crew was experienced and dangerous, New World veterans who had been driven back to East Blue by defeats at the hands of stronger opponents, but remained formidable by local standards. Their captain carried a bounty of 45 million berries, and his crew included several members with their own substantial prices on their heads. They had chosen the Daden hideout as a base of operations while they planned their next move, apparently unaware that the mountain bandits were under the protection of someone far more dangerous than they appeared. "Clear out," their captain announced to Daden and her crew. "We need this place and you're in the way. Leave now and maybe we'll let you live." Daden's response was to spit in the dirt at the pirates' feet. "This is our home. You want it, you'll have to take it." What followed was a brief but vicious skirmish that ended with most of the bandits injured and the pirates firmly in control of the mountain hideout. Daden herself was beaten unconscious, her crew scattered or captured. It was in this state that Luffy found them when he arrived for his periodic visit. "Let them go," he said quietly, standing at the edge of the clearing where the pirates had made their camp. The pirate captain looked up from counting stolen supplies, taking in Luffy's small stature and apparent youth with amusement. "And you are?" "Someone who cares about these people," Luffy replied, his hand resting casually on the grip of the quality blade that Mihawk had given him. "Leave now and this doesn't have to get ugly." The pirate's laughter was loud and mocking, right up until Luffy's next movement. "Gamu gamu no." The words were spoken so quietly they were barely audible, but something in their tone made every pirate in the clearing suddenly pay attention. Tatsumaki Jiri. What happened next would be talked about in East Blue taverns for years to come. Luffy's body spun like a top while his stretched arms extended in every direction, his sword trailing arcs of Haki-enhanced steel that carved through the air with surgical precision. When the technique ended 3 seconds later, every weapon in the pirate camp had been severed cleanly in half. Every rope that had been used to restrain the bandits had been cut. And every pirate was sporting at least one shallow but precisely placed cut that had destroyed their clothing while barely scratching their skin. The message was unmistakable. "I could have killed all of you, but chose not to." "New World bounty of 45 million, Luffy observed conversationally, looking at the pirate captain with the kind of casual assessment that suggested he was evaluating the difficulty of swatting a particularly large fly. "Not bad for someone from the first half of the Grand Line, but this is East Blue, where people like me look after people like them." He gestured toward the freed bandits with one rubber-extended arm while keeping his sword pointed at the pirate captain with the other. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back on your ship, sail away from this island, and never come back. And in exchange, I won't demonstrate what the advanced techniques look like." The threat was delivered in the same friendly, conversational tone that Luffy had always used. But combined with the casual display of overwhelming skill, it carried the weight of absolute certainty. The pirates left without another word. "Damn, kid," Daden said as Luffy helped tend to her injuries. "When did you get so scary?" "I'm not scary," Luffy protested with a grin that was both innocent and terrifying. "I'm just really good at protecting people I care about." As he sailed back to Kuraigana Island that evening, Luffy reflected on how much had changed since that first encounter with Mihawk in Foosha Village. He was stronger now, strong enough to defeat experienced New World pirates without seriously injuring them, strong enough to protect the people he cared about from threats they couldn't handle themselves. But more than that, he was developing into exactly the kind of person Sabo would have wanted him to become. Someone who used strength to create justice rather than simply impose his will on others. The path ahead was still long and full of unknown challenges. But for the first time since Sabo's death, Luffy felt genuinely optimistic about his ability to make the world a better place, even if he had to become the strongest person in it first. The morning of Luffy's 17th birthday dawned gray and overcast, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything on Kuraigana Island seem more gothic and foreboding than usual. It was, Mihawk reflected as he observed his students' final training session, entirely appropriate weather for what was essentially a graduation ceremony. "Again," he commanded, watching Luffy flow through the advanced kata that had taken 3 years to perfect. Your third form transition is still too visible. A truly skilled opponent would exploit that opening. Luffy nodded without breaking his rhythm, adjusting his stance minutely to mask the telegraphed movement. The correction was so subtle that most observers wouldn't have noticed it, but Mihawk's trained eye caught the improvement immediately. 10 years. 10 years of daily training, constant refinement, and gradual evolution had transformed the enthusiastic but undisciplined child who'd first arrived on this island into something genuinely extraordinary. The young man moving through sword forms in the castle courtyard bore little resemblance to that 7-year-old boy, except for the unmistakable core of determination that had never wavered. Better, Mihawk acknowledged as Luffy completed the sequence. Your technical mastery is now adequate for the challenges you'll face in Paradise. Your Haki development exceeds what most achieve in a lifetime of training. Your physical conditioning approaches the limits of human capability. It was, by Mihawk's standards, extravagant praise. Luffy had learned to recognize these moments of approval over the years, understanding that his teacher's restraint made such acknowledgments all the more valuable. "And my rubber techniques?" Luffy asked, unconsciously stretching his arm while he spoke, a habit he'd developed during adolescence as his devil fruit powers had evolved alongside his growing mastery. "Unprecedented," Mihawk replied honestly. "I have taught you everything I can about the marriage of swordsmanship and supernatural ability. What you do with that knowledge will determine whether you become merely skilled or truly legendary." The assessment was accurate, if understated. Over the past decade, Luffy had developed fighting techniques that no traditional swordsman could replicate. His ability to stretch his limbs while maintaining perfect weapon control had led to innovations in reach, timing, and tactical flexibility that redefined what was possible in blade combat. But more than that, he had learned to integrate his devil fruit abilities with advanced Haki in ways that pushed both powers beyond their normal limitations. His armament Haki could now flow through his extended limbs without losing intensity, allowing him to strike with devastating force at ranges that should have been impossible. His observation Haki had developed to the point where he could sense hostile intent from hundreds of meters away, making surprise attacks virtually impossible. Most impressively, he had begun developing what appeared to be the early stages of Conqueror's Haki, the rare ability that marked those with the potential to stand above others. It manifested differently in Luffy than in most others Mihawk had encountered, less as overwhelming dominance and more as an irresistible charisma that made people want to follow his lead. "There is one final lesson," Mihawk said as Luffy sheathed his sword, a blade that had begun showing the telltale signs of becoming permanently infused with its wielder's will. Not yet a true black blade like Yoru, but well on its way to that legendary status. "What kind of lesson?" Luffy asked, though his expression suggested he suspected this wouldn't be a typical technical instruction. "A philosophical one," Mihawk gestured toward the castle, indicating they should continue their conversation indoors. "You have achieved mastery over technique, but technique without purpose is merely impressive choreography. Before you set out to change the world, you must understand what you wish to change it into." They settled in Mihawk's study, a room lined with books on everything from military strategy to political philosophy. Over the years, Luffy had read many of these volumes at his teacher's insistence, developing an understanding of power dynamics and social structures that complemented his physical training. "10 years ago, you told me you wanted to become the strongest person in the world," Mihawk began. "You now possess the capability to make that claim seriously, but strength alone is not enough to achieve your true goals." "You mean protecting people," Luffy said, demonstrating the philosophical sophistication that had developed alongside his physical abilities. "I mean creating a world where such protection is less necessary," Mihawk corrected. "You have the potential to become more than just a powerful individual. You could become a force for lasting change. But only if you understand the responsibility that comes with such influence." The conversation that followed was perhaps the most important of Luffy's education. They discussed the nature of leadership, the difference between inspiring fear and inspiring loyalty, the ways that individual actions could create systemic changes. Mihawk shared insights gained from decades of observing the world's power structures, while Luffy contributed perspectives shaped by his experiences in the Grey Terminal and his understanding of injustice at the ground level. "Remember," Mihawk concluded as their discussion wound down, "strength without wisdom becomes tyranny. Wisdom without strength becomes irrelevance. You must balance both if you wish to create anything lasting." It was a lesson that would prove crucial in the months and years to come. The following morning brought unexpected visitors to Kuraigana Island. The Red Force, flagship of the Red Hair Pirates, cut through the perpetual mist surrounding the island like a knife through silk. Its arrival was announced by the excited chatter of the human drills, who had learned over the years that visitors usually meant interesting developments. Luffy sensed the ship's approach long before it became visible, his observation Haki picking up the distinctive presence of its crew from miles away. What caught his attention wasn't just their strength, though several of the approaching pirates registered as genuinely formidable, but the quality of their intent. These weren't raiders or conquerors. They felt more like explorers. "Red Hair Shanks," Mihawk observed as they watched the ship drop anchor in the island's small harbor. "I wonder what brings him here." Luffy's heart rate increased slightly at the name. He'd heard stories about the red-haired Yonko throughout his training, mostly from Mihawk's occasional observations about the political balance of the New World. Shanks was described as someone who commanded respect through strength but preferred diplomacy to violence, a ruler who protected territory not through fear but through genuine loyalty from those under his protection. "Is he dangerous?" Luffy asked, though his tone suggested curiosity rather than concern. "Extremely," Mihawk replied, "but not to us, I suspect. His presence here suggests he has something specific in mind." The something specific turned out to be Luffy himself. Shanks arrived at the castle gates accompanied by only 2 of his crew members, a demonstration of either supreme confidence or calculated respect. Up close, the Yonko was both more and less imposing than Luffy had expected. Shorter than Mihawk, but carrying himself with the kind of easy authority that came from absolute certainty in his own capabilities. His famous red hair was slightly unkempt, and his clothes were practical rather than ostentatious. But his eyes held depths that spoke of experiences and knowledge that few humans ever acquired. "Hawkeyes," Shanks greeted with the casual familiarity of old rivals who had evolved into something approaching friendship. "You're looking well," Shanks, Mihawk replied with equal casualness. "To what do I owe this visit?" "Curiosity, mostly." Shanks' gaze shifted to Luffy, studying the young man with obvious interest. "I've been hearing some interesting stories about your student. Thought it was time I met him in person." The assessment was mutual. Luffy found himself equally fascinated by the legendary pirate, using his enhanced senses to read everything he could about the man's character and capabilities. What he discovered was intriguing, tremendous strength held under perfect control, sharp intelligence masked by casual demeanor, and underneath it all, a profound sadness that suggested heavy burdens carried with quiet grace. "You must be Luffy," Shanks said, extending his hand in greeting. "I knew your grandfather back in the day. You have his eyes. And his stubborn streak, I suspect," Mihawk added dryly. The handshake was brief but telling. Both men were evaluating each other through that simple contact, gauging strength, control, and character through subtle cues that most people would never notice. "Your teacher tells me you're quite skilled with a blade," Shanks observed. "I do my best," Luffy replied with characteristic modesty that didn't quite hide his underlying confidence. "Care to demonstrate?" What followed was not quite a sparring match and not quite a formal duel, but something in between. Shanks drew his sword, a beautiful blade that hummed with barely contained power, while Luffy responded with his own weapon, the steel gleaming with the subtle enhancement of armament Haki. The exchange lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds contained enough technique and tactical sophistication to fill hours of analysis. Luffy's rubber-enhanced swordsmanship created attack angles that Shanks had clearly never encountered before, while the Yonko's experience and overwhelming skill forced Luffy to push his abilities to their current limits. When they separated, both combatants were breathing slightly harder but grinning with genuine respect. "Impressive," Shanks said sincerely. "Very impressive. How old are you, boy?" 17, Luffy replied, still catching his breath from the intense exchange. 17, Shanks shook his head in amazement. "At 17, I was still learning which end of a sword to hold. You're already developing techniques I've never seen before." "Good teacher," Luffy said, glancing gratefully at Mihawk. "Good student," Mihawk corrected. "Technique can be taught, but creativity cannot. The innovations you've developed are your own." The conversation that followed revealed why Shanks had really come to Kuraigana Island. Over the past several years, reports had been filtering through the Grand Line's information networks about unusual activities in East Blue. A young swordsman who could apparently stretch his limbs at will. Pirate crews with substantial bounties disappearing after encounters with someone who matched that description. Marine stations reporting incidents of precise, non-lethal violence that suggested someone with incredible skill was actively protecting civilian populations. The world government is starting to take notice. Shanks explained as they sat in Mihawk's dining room, sharing a meal that demonstrated why the castle's kitchen was equipped for much larger gatherings. They don't like unknowns, especially unknowns who seem to be interfering with their operations in the blues. Let them take notice, Luffy said calmly. I'm not doing anything wrong. Wrong and illegal aren't always the same thing, Shanks replied with the voice of hard experience. And the government has ways of making life difficult for people they consider threats, regardless of whether those people have actually done anything threatening. The warning was delivered casually, but Luffy's enhanced empathy caught the genuine concern underlying it. This wasn't an attempt at intimidation, it was advice from someone who understood the political realities of the world far better than most. What would you suggest? Mihawk asked, recognizing the implicit offer of guidance in Shanks' words. Careful timing, Shanks replied. The Grand Line is about to become a much more interesting place. The balance of power that's held for the past several years is starting to shift. New players are emerging, old alliances are being tested, and opportunity is creating chaos in all the right ways. He paused to take a drink before continuing. A young swordsman with unusual abilities and no clear factional affiliations could find himself with options during times like these, especially if he's smart about how he presents himself to the world. The political analysis was sophisticated and clearly based on insider knowledge that few people possessed. Shanks wasn't just offering advice, he was sharing intelligence that could be genuinely valuable for someone preparing to enter the Grand Line's complex power dynamics. You're suggesting I become a pirate, Luffy observed. I'm suggesting you become whatever serves your goals best, Shanks corrected. But if those goals include protecting innocent people and challenging unjust systems, then yes, piracy might offer more flexibility than other career paths. The conversation continued through the afternoon and into the evening, covering everything from navigation techniques to recruitment strategies. Shanks proved to be an excellent teacher, sharing insights about leadership, crew dynamics, and the practical realities of life as a wanted man. But the most important exchange came as the evening wound down and the red hair pirates prepared to return to their ship. There's something I want to give you, Shanks said, reaching into his coat to pull out a familiar straw hat that made Luffy's breath catch in recognition. That hat, Luffy began, belonged to someone very important to me, Shanks finished. Someone who changed the world through the simple act of refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they were. The implications hit Luffy like a physical blow. Every person who'd grown up in the pirate age knew the stories about Gal D. Roger, the pirate king whose execution had launched the current era of maritime adventure and chaos. But to be holding something that had actually belonged to that legendary figure. I can't accept this, Luffy protested, though his hands were already reaching for the hat with obvious longing. Yes, you can, Shanks replied firmly, because I think you're going to need it. The path you're choosing isn't going to be easy, and sometimes you'll need reminders of what you're fighting for. He placed the hat on Luffy's head with ceremonial precision. When you've become the man I think you can become, when you've achieved the goals I think you can achieve, return this hat to me, but not before. The weight of the straw hat was negligible, but the weight of what it represented was enormous. This wasn't just a gift, it was a statement of faith, an expression of belief in Luffy's potential that carried the authority of one of the world's most powerful pirates. I'll treasure it, Luffy said solemnly. I know you will, Shanks replied with a smile that mixed warmth with sadness. Just be careful out there. The Grand Line eats people who aren't prepared for its realities. The farewell might have ended there, with handshakes and well wishes as the red hair pirates returned to their ship. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The Sea King that erupted from the harbor waters was massive even by Grand Line standards, a serpentine monster easily 100 meters long, with jaws that could swallow a ship whole. Its appearance was so sudden, and its size so overwhelming that even Shanks' experienced crew was caught off guard. What happened next unfolded with the kind of terrible clarity that comes during moments of extreme crisis. The Sea King's initial attack was aimed at the Red Force, apparently viewing the pirate ship as either a threat or a meal. But its massive bulk displaced enough water to create waves that threatened to swamp the smaller boats that local fishermen used for their daily work. Among those boats was one carrying a family, parents, and two small children who had been returning from a day of fishing when the monster's emergence turned calm waters into churning chaos. Luffy reacted without conscious thought. Gamu Gamu no Red Hawk. The technique was one of his most advanced, a combination of rubber physics, fire enhanced through friction, and armament Haki that created a projectile attack capable of devastating impact. His fist, wreathed in flames and hardened to the consistency of steel, struck the Sea King's head with enough force to redirect its attention from the fishing boat to the more obvious threat, which meant it was now focused on him. The creature's retaliation was swift and vicious, a snapping attack that would have bisected any normal human. But Luffy's observation Haki gave him just enough warning to twist away from the worst of the impact, though the Sea King's teeth still caught his left shoulder and sent him spinning through the air to crash into the harbor's wooden dock. Luffy, Shanks' shout carried genuine alarm as the Yonko leaped from his ship with his sword already drawn. But the Sea King was already following up its initial attack, lunging toward the dazed teenager with predatory focus. Its jaws opened wide enough to swallow a house, and there was no time for rescue, no angle for intervention. Shanks moved anyway. The red hair pirate's speed was genuinely superhuman, a demonstration of physical capability that put him in a class with the world's most dangerous individuals. He crossed the distance between ship and dock in a fraction of a second, interposing himself between Luffy and certain death with reckless disregard for his own safety. His sword, enhanced with Conqueror's Haki that made the air itself seem to tremble, carved through the Sea King's skull like butter. The massive creature died instantly, its momentum carrying it forward even as its brain ceased to function. But momentum was a terrible thing when dealing with creatures that large. The Sea King's body crashed into the dock with enough force to shatter stone and send debris flying in all directions. Among that debris was a jagged piece of timber that caught Shanks in the left arm, severing it cleanly just below the elbow. The silence that followed was deafening. "Your arm," Luffy whispered, staring in horror at the injury he had inadvertently caused. "Oh God, your arm! It's just an arm," Shanks replied with forced lightness, though sweat beaded on his forehead from shock and pain. "I've got another one. But you're a swordsman, and it's my fault." If you hadn't acted, that family would be dead," Shanks interrupted firmly. "You did the right thing. Sometimes the right thing has costs, but that doesn't make it wrong." The philosophical lesson was profound, but Luffy was too stricken with guilt to fully appreciate it. This man, this legendary pirate who had shown him nothing but kindness and respect, had sacrificed a part of himself to save someone he'd met only hours before. "I'll get stronger," Luffy said with sudden, fierce determination. "I'll get so strong that nobody will ever have to sacrifice anything to protect me again." "I know you will," Shanks replied, and despite his injury, his smile was genuine. "But remember, getting stronger isn't just about being able to protect yourself. It's about being able to protect others without asking them to sacrifice for you." As the red hair pirates prepared to depart for medical treatment that their captain desperately needed, Shanks pulled Luffy aside for a final conversation. "That hat," he said, gesturing to the straw hat that had somehow remained on Luffy's head throughout the chaos. "Its previous owner once told me that the most important battle isn't the one you fight with your fists or your sword. It's the one you fight with your spirit, the battle to remain true to your principles even when the world tries to compromise them." He paused, studying Luffy's face with intense focus. "You're going to face that battle many times in the years ahead. People will try to convince you that pragmatism is more important than idealism, that survival matters more than integrity. They'll offer you power and position in exchange for small compromises that don't seem important at the time. And if they do, then you remember what happened today. You remember that sometimes the right choice costs something precious, but it's still the right choice. And you remember that the hat you're wearing belonged to someone who changed the world by refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they were." With that final piece of advice, Shanks returned to his ship, leaving Luffy standing on the damaged dock with a head full of new responsibilities and a heart full of determination. That evening, as Mihawk helped him treat the injuries from his encounter with the Sea King, Luffy made the declaration that would define the rest of his life. "I'm going to become the Pirate King," he announced with quiet certainty. Mihawk raised an eyebrow. "An ambitious goal, and how do you intend to achieve it?" "By assembling a crew of people who share my dream of making the world better, by finding the one piece and proving that someone can reach the top without compromising their principles, and by showing everyone that strength can be used to protect instead of dominate." "And your swordsmanship?" Mihawk asked. "Will you abandon that pursuit in favor of this new ambition?" Luffy's answer came without hesitation. "I'll become strong enough with a blade that people will have to take notice when I tell them to stop hurting innocent people. Strong enough that Zoro, when I find him, will have someone worthy to chase. Strong enough that you'll be proud of what you taught me." It was, Mihawk reflected, exactly the kind of answer he should have expected from someone he'd spent 10 years training. Ambitious without being unrealistic, idealistic without being naive, confident without being arrogant. "Then you have my blessing," he said formally. "Go forth, Monkey D. Luffy. Show the world what a true swordsman can become." The next morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect day for new beginnings. Luffy's small boat, loaded with supplies and equipped with a log pose that Mihawk had provided, sat ready in the harbor. The human drills had gathered to see him off, chattering among themselves in what sounded suspiciously like expressions of pride and affection. "Remember," Mihawk said as they prepared for the final farewell, "technique will only carry you so far. Beyond a certain point, victory depends not on what you can do, but on who you choose to be." "I'll remember," Luffy promised, adjusting the straw hat that had become his most precious possession. As he sailed away from Kuraigana Island for the last time, Luffy felt the weight of everything he was leaving behind and everything he was sailing toward. 10 years of training, a lifetime of dreams, and the hopes of everyone who had invested in his potential. But more than that, he felt ready to find his crew, ready to challenge the world's injustices, ready to prove that someone trained by Dracule Mihawk could indeed become the Pirate King. The Grand Line waited ahead, vast and dangerous and full of possibilities. Luffy sailed toward it with a smile on his face and a song in his heart. The first thing Luffy noticed about being a pirate wasn't the freedom or the adventure, it was the loneliness. After 10 years of constant companionship with Mihawk and periodic interactions with the human drills, the solitude of sailing alone across East Blue's vast waters was almost overwhelming. His small boat, while well-equipped and seaworthy, felt impossibly empty without someone to share meals with, to practice techniques with, to simply talk to during the long hours between islands. But loneliness, Luffy discovered, had unexpected benefits. Without distractions, he found himself meditating more deeply than ever before, his observation Haki stretching out across miles of ocean to catalog every sea creature, every weather pattern, every distant ship that crossed his awareness. His connection to the world around him grew stronger with each passing day, until he could sense schools of fish from underwater or approaching storms from beyond the horizon. It was this enhanced awareness that led him to his first real adventure as a pirate captain. The marine vessel was small, a patrol boat with a crew of perhaps 20 men, pursuing what appeared to be an even smaller civilian craft. Luffy's observation Haki told him the full story. The Marines were radiating the kind of cold satisfaction that came from a successful hunt, while the people on the fleeing boat were broadcasting pure terror. The intercepted radio communications, picked up by his boat's transponder snail, confirmed his suspicions. Unauthorized departure from Shell's town. Captain Morgan's orders are to bring them back for processing. Just wanted to visit their daughter on the next island. Doesn't matter what they wanted. Nobody leaves Shell's town without proper authorization. Luffy changed course without conscious thought, his boat cutting through the waves with newfound urgency. Whatever was happening here, it sounded exactly like the kind of abuse of power that he'd sworn to oppose. The confrontation was brief and decisive. "Marine vessel," Luffy called out as he pulled alongside the patrol boat, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that made people pay attention. "You're harassing civilians. Stand down." The Marine lieutenant commanding the patrol boat took one look at Luffy's small craft and lone occupant before breaking into derisive laughter. "Stand down. Kid, do you have any idea who you're talking to? We're Marines. You're just some punk with a boat." "I'm someone who doesn't like bullies," Luffy replied calmly, his hand resting on his sword hilt. Last chance to let those people go. What followed was perhaps the most one-sided naval engagement in East Blue history. Luffy's Gamu Gamu no Jet pistol technique had evolved considerably since his childhood. Enhanced with armament Haki and delivered with rubber-accelerated speed, his punch didn't just disable the patrol boat's cannon. It launched the entire weapon system clean off the deck and into the ocean with surgical precision. His follow-up attack, Gamu Gamu no Whip, used his stretched leg to snap the ship's mast like a twig while carefully avoiding any areas where crew members might be injured by falling debris. The entire engagement lasted less than 30 seconds, leaving the Marines floating in the water next to their disabled vessel, while the civilian family they'd been pursuing stared in amazement at their unexpected rescuer. "Thank you," the father said, tears streaming down his face. "They were going to take us back to him." "Him," Luffy prompted gently. "Captain Morgan," the man replied, and the name was spoken with the kind of fear usually reserved for natural disasters. He's turned Shell's town into his personal kingdom. Nobody can leave without his permission, nobody can speak against his decisions, and anyone who tries. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a cannon blast. Luffy had encountered corrupt officials before, but this sounded like something more systematic, a complete breakdown of the justice system that Marines were supposed to represent. "Where is Shell's town?" he asked. 3 hours later, Luffy sailed into Shell's town's harbor with the kind of grim determination that his training with Mihawk had cultivated. The town itself was immediately recognizable as a place under authoritarian control, too clean, too quiet, with people hurrying about their business while carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone in uniform. The Marine base dominated the town's center, a massive structure that seemed designed more for intimidation than functionality. Carved into its facade was an enormous statue of a man with an axe-shaped jaw and an expression of megalomaniacal pride. Captain Morgan, Luffy assumed, noting how the statue's design emphasized brutality over heroism. But what really caught his attention was the figure tied to a cross in the base's courtyard, a young man with green hair and a distinctive three-sword fighting style evident from the weapons at his side. Even from a distance, Luffy could sense the incredible strength contained in that bound form, along with a will that remained unbroken despite obvious suffering. That has to be him. Roronoha Zoro, the pirate hunter. Luffy had heard stories about the wandering swordsman who'd been making a name for himself throughout East Blue. A fighter of extraordinary skill who pursued bounty hunting with single-minded dedication while searching for someone strong enough to give him a real challenge. Someone, Luffy realized with growing excitement, who had probably heard stories about Dracule Mihawk. The guards at the Marine base's front gate were more obstacle than threat. Luffy's observation Haki let him predict their movements with perfect accuracy, while his enhanced speed allowed him to disable both men with precise strikes that left them unconscious but uninjured. He found Zoro exactly where he'd appeared from outside, tied to a cross-shaped wooden structure, his body showing signs of prolonged exposure but his eyes still burning with defiant determination. "Roronoha Zoro," Luffy said by way of greeting. "Who's asking?" Zoro's voice was hoarse but steady, his gaze tracking Luffy's movements with the attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. "Someone who's looking for a crew member," Luffy replied honestly. "Someone who thinks you might be exactly what I'm looking for." Zoro's eyes widened slightly as he took in more details of his visitor's appearance, the quality of his sword, the controlled way he moved, the unconscious guards behind him. "You're strong," he observed. It wasn't a question. "Strong enough," Luffy confirmed. "The question is whether you want to be stronger." Before Zoro could respond, the sound of approaching boots announced new arrivals. A squad of Marines, led by a young man with distinctive pink hair and an attitude that screamed entitled incompetence, marched into the courtyard with weapons drawn. "Hey," the pink-haired Marine shouted. "You're not supposed to be here. This is a restricted area. I'm here to free this man," Luffy said calmly, not taking his eyes off Zoro. "He doesn't deserve to be treated like this." "That's Helmeppo," Zoro said quietly, his voice carrying a contempt so profound it was almost tangible. "Captain Morgan's son, spoiled brat who thinks daddy's rank makes him untouchable." "Untouchable?" Luffy repeated thoughtfully. "Let's test that theory." What happened next was less a fight than a demonstration. Helmeppo's squad of Marines were competent by local standards, but they were facing someone who'd spent 10 years training under the world's strongest swordsman. Luffy moved through them like water flowing around stones, his sword work precisely calculated to disable weapons and armor without causing serious injury. When the dust settled, every Marine except Helmeppo was unconscious, and the captain's son was cowering behind an overturned table. "Please don't hurt me," Helmeppo whimpered. "My father will give you anything you want. Money, position, whatever. I want you to release Zoro," Luffy said simply. "And I want your father to stop abusing his authority." "I can't do that, he'll kill me." The naked terror in Helmeppo's voice was genuine, and Luffy's enhanced empathy picked up the complex mixture of fear, resentment, and desperate need for approval that drove the young man's behavior. This wasn't just a spoiled brat, this was someone who'd been systematically broken by an abusive authority figure. "Then I'll talk to your father myself," Luffy decided. The confrontation with Captain Morgan was everything Luffy had expected, and more. The Marine captain was a mountain of a man, his jaw literally replaced with an axe blade that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. His office was decorated with portraits of himself in increasingly grandiose poses, and his attitude radiated the kind of absolute authority that brooked no dissent. "You dare to assault my marines," Morgan roared when Luffy was finally brought before him. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Someone who's forgotten what marines are supposed to stand for," Luffy replied calmly. "Someone who's turned protecting people into bullying them." "I am justice," Morgan bellowed, his axe jaw gleaming as he prepared to demonstrate his point through violence. The battle that followed was the first time since leaving Kuraigana Island that Luffy had faced an opponent who required genuine effort to defeat. Morgan was genuinely strong, his physical capabilities enhanced by whatever procedure had given him his axe jaw, his fighting style brutal but effective. But strength without wisdom was just violence, and violence without purpose was just destruction. "Gamu Gamu no," Luffy began, his body stretching as he prepared one of his signature techniques. Jet Sword, the attack combined everything Mihawk had taught him about precision with everything he'd learned about his devil fruit abilities. His stretched arm snapped forward with tremendous force, but instead of using his fist, he led with his sword armament Haki, coating the blade as it struck Morgan's axe jaw with surgical precision. The impact didn't destroy the prosthetic. That would have been excessive and potentially fatal. Instead, it damaged the mechanism that allowed Morgan to control the jaw, leaving the Marine captain with a mouth that wouldn't close properly and an expression of perpetual surprise. "It's over," Luffy announced as Morgan collapsed, defeated but still breathing. "Your reign of terror ends now." The liberation of Shell's town was accomplished with surprisingly little fanfare. With Morgan incapacitated and his enforcers either unconscious or cowed, the townspeople found their courage returning in a rush of relief and barely suppressed joy. But it was Zoro's reaction that mattered most to Luffy. "You're trained by Mihawk," the swordsman said as Luffy cut him free from his bonds. It wasn't a question. Zoro's expertise was sufficient to recognize the distinctive style and philosophy underlying Luffy's technique. "For 10 years, Luffy confirmed, "he taught me everything I know about swordsmanship. And now you want me to join your crew?" Again, not a question. "I want you to help me become the Pirate King," Luffy said honestly. "And I want to help you become the world's greatest swordsman." Zoro was quiet for a long moment, studying Luffy with the intensity of someone making a life-changing decision. "You know what that means," he said finally. "If I'm going to be the world's greatest swordsman, eventually I'll have to surpass Mihawk. I'll have to defeat your teacher." "I know," Luffy replied with a grin that was equal parts confident and excited. "I'm looking forward to it. And if we meet in battle before then, if we end up on opposite sides of a fight, then we'll fight with everything we have, and whoever wins will help the other get stronger." Luffy's answer came without hesitation. "That's what real rivalry means." Zoro's answering smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. "Captain," he said, offering a slight bow that managed to convey both respect and challenge, "I accept." The next few months were a whirlwind of adventure, recruitment, and gradual crew building that took them across East Blue's scattered islands. Each new crew member brought different challenges and different opportunities for Luffy to demonstrate the breadth of his training. Nami joined after Luffy proved he could navigate political complexities as well as physical dangers, negotiating with Buggy the Clown in a way that preserved the navigator's freedom without unnecessary bloodshed. The battle with Buggy himself was almost anticlimactic. Luffy's swordsmanship made quick work of someone whose fighting style relied more on theatrical flair than genuine skill. "Gamu Gamu no Sword Barrage," Luffy announced as he unleashed a technique that combined rapid-fire stretching attacks with precise blade work, simultaneously severing every piece of Buggy's separated body while avoiding any cuts that would cause permanent damage. Usopp's recruitment came after Luffy demonstrated that strength could be used for protection rather than conquest, standing up to Captain Kuro's schemes with a combination of tactical planning and overwhelming force that impressed the young sniper's sense of justice. The battle with Kuro was more challenging. The former Marine captain's silent step technique pushed Luffy's observation Haki to its limits as he tracked movements that were almost too fast to follow. But years of sparring with Mihawk had prepared him for opponents who combined speed with precision. "You're fast," Luffy acknowledged as he deflected another series of claw strikes, his sword moving in defensive patterns that turned aside attacks from impossible angles. But speed without purpose is just showing off. His counterattack, Gamu Gamu no Jet Sword Storm, created a whirling barrier of Haki-enhanced steel that forced Kuro to either retreat or risk being cut to pieces. When the former captain chose retreat, Luffy was waiting with a precisely placed Gamu Gamu no pistol that ended the fight without ending the man's life. Sanji joined after witnessing Luffy's philosophical approach to conflict resolution during the confrontation with Don Krieg. The cook was particularly impressed by how Luffy handled the moral complexities of fighting someone who was genuinely hungry and desperate. "I won't let you hurt these people," Luffy told Krieg as the armored pirate prepared his most devastating weapons. "But I understand why you're doing this. Let me help you find another way." The offer was genuine, backed by strength sufficient to make it meaningful. When Krieg refused, choosing violence over negotiation, Luffy's response was swift and decisive. "Armament Haki, penetration," he announced quietly, his fist becoming wreathed in the advanced form of Haki that Mihawk had taught him. The punch that followed bypassed Krieg's supposedly impenetrable armor entirely, striking the man inside with carefully controlled force that knocked him unconscious without causing internal injuries. But it was the confrontation with Arlong that truly tested everything Luffy had learned about balancing power with responsibility. The Fishman's operation in Foosha Village was systematic oppression on a scale that reminded Luffy uncomfortably of the Grey Terminal incident. Arlong had turned an entire region into his personal kingdom, extracting tribute through violence and maintaining control through fear. More troubling, he was doing it with tacit marine approval, corruption that went all the way to the top of the East Blue hierarchy. "You humans disgust me," Arlong declared when Luffy finally confronted him in Arlong Park. "You're weak, you're cowardly, and you think you deserve to rule the seas just because there are more of you." "You're right about some humans being terrible," Luffy replied calmly, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "But that doesn't give you the right to hurt innocent people. Being stronger doesn't make you better." The battle that followed was Luffy's most difficult challenge since leaving Kuraigana Island. Arlong was genuinely formidable, his fishman physiology giving him advantages in speed and strength that even Luffy's training couldn't entirely overcome. His fighting style was brutal and effective, combining natural weapons with a tactical intelligence that made him dangerous in ways that went beyond raw power. But more than that, he forced Luffy to confront uncomfortable truths about the world's power structures. Arlong's grievances against human society weren't entirely wrong. Fishmen did face systematic discrimination, and many of his followers had genuine reasons for their anger. "You think you're a hero?" Arlong snarled as they traded increasingly powerful attacks around the ruins of his fortress. "But you're just another human who wants to impose your will on others." "I'm someone who wants to stop people from getting hurt," Luffy corrected, his sword work growing more precise as the battle continued. "Whether they're human or fishmen doesn't matter to me." The technique that finally ended the fight was one of Luffy's most advanced, a combination of his devil fruit abilities, advanced armament Haki, and the precision swordsmanship that Mihawk had drilled into him over 10 years of training. "Gamu Gamu no," he began, his body stretching in preparation for the attack. Gear second, sword speed. The transformation was unlike anything his crew had seen before. Luffy's skin took on a pinkish hue as his enhanced blood flow increased his speed and power to superhuman levels. But instead of just making his punches faster, the technique enhanced his swordsmanship, allowing him to move with the kind of speed that made his blade seem to teleport between positions. The final strike was so fast that Arlong never saw it coming, a precision cut that severed the Sharkman's weapon while leaving him completely unharmed but definitively defeated. As Arlong collapsed, overwhelmed by the speed and precision of the attack, Luffy stood over him with an expression that mixed triumph with genuine sadness. "I'm sorry your people have been treated badly," he said quietly. "But hurting innocent people won't fix that. If you really want to make things better, you have to find ways to change people's minds, not just force them to obey." The liberation of Foosha Village marked the end of Luffy's East Blue adventures and the completion of his initial crew recruitment. As they prepared to enter the Grand Line, each member of the Straw Hat Pirates had been fundamentally changed by their experiences with a captain who combined overwhelming strength with unwavering moral principles. Zoro had found someone whose approach to strength aligned with his own pursuit of excellence, while challenging him to think more deeply about what that strength should be used for. Their sparring sessions had become legendary among the crew, battles that pushed both swordsmen to their limits while demonstrating techniques that seemed to redefine what was possible in blade combat. Nami had discovered that not all powerful people were interested in using that power for selfish gain. Luffy's approach to leadership, strength in service of others rather than dominance over them, had given her hope that the world could be changed for the better. Usopp had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear when action was needed. Watching Luffy face opponents who outclassed him in various ways while never backing down from his principles had inspired the young sniper to be braver than he'd ever thought possible. Sanji had found someone who shared his belief that strength should be used to protect rather than destroy. Luffy's careful balance between overwhelming force and merciful restraint had earned the cook's deepest respect and loyalty. But perhaps most importantly, Luffy himself had learned that being a captain meant more than just being the strongest person on the crew. It meant being someone that others could believe in, someone whose vision of the future was worth fighting for, someone who could inspire others to be better than they thought they could be. As the Going Merry sailed toward Reverse Mountain and the entrance to the Grand Line, Luffy stood at the bow with the straw hat that Shanks had given him firmly settled on his head. Behind him, his crew prepared for the challenges ahead with the kind of confident determination that came from having already proven themselves in battle. The Grand Line waited ahead, vast, dangerous, and full of opponents who would test everything they had learned. But Luffy felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, he had been trained by the world's strongest swordsman, had assembled a crew of extraordinary individuals, and had already proven that strength could be used to create justice rather than simply impose will. The next phase of his journey would be even more dangerous, but it would also be the true beginning of his quest to become the Pirate King. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he could almost hear Mihawk's voice reminding him that technique would only carry him so far. Beyond a certain point, victory would depend not on what he could do, but on who he chose to be. Luffy smiled as the Grand Line's chaotic currents caught their ship, carrying them toward adventures that would reshape the world itself. He knew exactly who he chose to be. The Grand Line announced itself with a storm. Not the gentle rains and predictable winds of East Blue, but a tempest that seemed to have been crafted by some malevolent god, specifically to test the resolve of anyone foolish enough to challenge the world's most dangerous sea. Lightning split the sky in patterns that defied meteorology, while waves the size of mountains crashed against the Going Merry's hull with enough force to shatter lesser vessels. Through it all, Luffy stood at the bow with his arms stretched wide, laughing with pure joy as the storm's fury washed over him. "This is incredible," he shouted over the thunder, his straw hat somehow remaining perfectly in place despite winds that could have torn sails to shreds. "Can you feel it? The sea itself is alive here." His crew, huddled in whatever shelter they could find, looked at their captain with expressions that mixed admiration with concern for his sanity. But Zoro, strapped to the mast to avoid being thrown overboard, was grinning with savage delight. "Finally," the swordsman muttered, his 3 blades secured but ready. "A sea that's as dangerous as the people who sail it." The storm lasted 3 days and 2 nights, long enough for the crew to understand that everything they thought they knew about sailing was now obsolete. The Grand Line operated by its own rules, and those rules were written in chaos and enforced through violence. When the skies finally cleared, they found themselves approaching an island that looked deceptively peaceful. Rolling hills covered in cacti, a small town with welcoming lights, and a harbor that seemed designed specifically for weary travelers seeking rest and resupply. Whiskey Peak, the first stop on their Grand Line adventure. "Something's wrong," Luffy said quietly as they approached the dock, his observation Haki painting a complex picture of the island's inhabitants. "The people here, their emotions don't match what they're showing us." "What do you mean?" Nami asked, though she'd learned to trust her captain's unusual insights over the past few months. "They're excited to see us, but not in a good way, more like predators who have spotted prey." The welcome they received was certainly enthusiastic. The entire town turned out to greet them, with music and food and celebration that seemed too perfect to be genuine. Their hosts, led by a woman with distinctively blue hair and a man whose hair defied several laws of physics, proclaimed them heroes and insisted on throwing a party in their honor. Luffy played along, his enhanced senses cataloging every detail while his crew enjoyed what appeared to be genuine hospitality. But as the evening wore on and alcohol flowed freely, he began to understand the true nature of their situation. Bounty hunters? The entire town was populated by agents of Baroque works, and they'd walked directly into a carefully orchestrated trap. The attack came at midnight, when the bounty hunters assumed their targets would be too drunk to fight effectively. They had clearly done their research, teams assigned to each crew member based on their known capabilities and fighting styles. What they hadn't accounted for was how much those capabilities had evolved since the crew's last public appearance. "Sorry," Luffy said conversationally as he stood amidst a circle of unconscious bounty hunters, his sword still sheathed because the fight hadn't required him to draw it. "But I don't drink," and I really don't like it when people try to hurt my friends. The battle for Whiskey Peak lasted exactly 17 minutes. By the time it was over, every Baroque Works agent on the island was either unconscious or had fled into the desert, and the Straw Hat Pirates had acquired their first real intelligence about the criminal organization that had been plaguing the Grand Line for years. More importantly, they had acquired a new crew member. "My name is Vivi," the blue-haired woman announced as she knelt before Luffy in formal surrender. "I'm actually Princess Nefiatari Vivi of the Alabasta Kingdom, and I've been working undercover to expose Baroque Works' plans to overthrow my father's government." The story that followed was complex, heartbreaking, and exactly the kind of injustice that Luffy had sworn to oppose. A criminal organization had spent years destabilizing one of the Grand Line's most prosperous kingdoms, turning citizens against their rulers through manufactured crises and carefully orchestrated chaos. "They're going to start a civil war," Vivi explained, her voice breaking with emotion. "Millions of innocent people will die, and my father will be blamed for failures that aren't his fault." "Then we'll stop them," Luffy said simply. "You don't understand," Vivi protested. "Their leader is one of the 7 warlords of the sea. Sir Crocodile is more powerful than anyone you've ever faced, and he has resources that—" "I was trained by Dracule Mihawk," Luffy interrupted gently. "I know what warlords are capable of, but I also know that being strong doesn't make you right." The journey to Alabasta became a race against time, with the Straw Hats pursuing Baroque Works agents across a series of increasingly dangerous islands, while Vivi provided intelligence and Luffy demonstrated capabilities that consistently exceeded everyone's expectations. The encounter with Mr. Five and Miss Valentine was over so quickly that most observers missed the actual techniques involved. Luffy's Gamu Gamu no Jet sword moved faster than the bomb man could explode, while his observation Haki let him predict Miss Valentine's weight-changing attacks with perfect accuracy. "Too slow," he observed as both opponents collapsed, defeated but unharmed. "If you're going to rely on devil fruit powers, you need to be faster than your opponent's reaction time." The battle with Mr. 3 in Little Garden was more challenging, requiring genuine tactical thinking to overcome the Waxman's ability to create near-indestructible barriers. But Luffy's solution was elegantly simple. Instead of trying to break through the wax, he used his advanced armament Haki to heat his blade until it could cut through anything. "Gamu Gamu no Flame Sword," he announced as his weapon ignited with friction-generated fire, the combination of heat and Haki proving more than sufficient to carve through Mr. 3's supposedly impenetrable defenses. But it was the confrontation with Crocodile in Alabasta that truly tested everything Mihawk had taught him about the relationship between strength and wisdom. Their first encounter, in the desert outside Yuba, was a disaster. Crocodile's Logia abilities made him effectively intangible to most attacks, while his control over sand gave him devastating offensive capabilities in an environment where his powers were maximized. "You're strong, boy," the warlord acknowledged as Luffy's initial attacks passed harmlessly through his sandy form. "Stronger than most who dare to challenge me, but strength means nothing if you can't land a hit." Crocodile was right. Despite years of training, despite techniques that could devastate normal opponents, Luffy found himself completely unable to affect someone who could turn into sand at will. His swordsmanship was useless against an enemy who had no solid form to cut. The defeat was humbling and educational. As Luffy lay buried in the desert sand, his crew captured and Vivi's kingdom sliding toward civil war, he was forced to confront the limitations of his current abilities. "Mihawk never taught me to fight Logia users," he realized, because he assumed I'd figure out the principles myself. The principles, when he finally understood them, were elegantly simple. Logia users weren't truly intangible, they were transforming their physical bodies into their respective elements, which meant they could be hit if you knew how to affect those elements directly. Water was the obvious solution for a sand user, but water was scarce in Alabasta's desert environment. However, Luffy's enhanced understanding of armament Haki suggested another possibility. If he could infuse his attacks with enough spiritual force, he might be able to affect Crocodile's sand form directly. The final battle in Alubarna was a masterclass in tactical adaptation. Instead of trying to overpower Crocodile with brute force, Luffy used everything Mihawk had taught him about precision and timing to create openings in the warlord's defense. "Gear second," he announced as his skin took on the familiar pinkish hue of accelerated blood flow. "Advanced armament, internal destruction." The combination was devastating. Luffy's enhanced speed let him keep pace with Crocodile's sandform movement, while his advanced Haki allowed him to affect the warlord even when he was transformed. But it was his swordsmanship that made the real difference, precise cuts that targeted Crocodile's sand form with surgical accuracy, forcing the warlord to solidify to avoid being dispersed entirely. "Impossible," Crocodile gasped as Luffy's blade carved through his supposedly intangible form. "No one should be able to touch me when I'm transformed. My teacher told me that technique without understanding is just impressive choreography," Luffy replied, his sword work flowing in patterns that gave Crocodile no time to recover. "You understand your powers, but you don't understand mine." The final technique was one Luffy had been developing since their first encounter, a combination of his devil fruit abilities, advanced Haki, and the precision swordsmanship that had taken years to master. "Gamu Gamu no," he began, his body stretching as he prepared the attack. Gigant Jet Sword, his arm extended to enormous proportions while simultaneously accelerating to superhuman speed, the blade at its tip wreathed in armament Haki so intense it seemed to bend light around it. The attack struck Crocodile with enough force to create a crater in the palace courtyard, but with enough precision to avoid causing fatal injuries. The warlord collapsed, defeated but alive, his grand plan for conquering Alabasta reduced to ruins by a teenager who'd learned to balance overwhelming power with careful restraint. "It's over," Luffy announced, and his words carried the weight of absolute authority. The crew's reaction to their captain's true capabilities was varied and revealing. Nami was amazed by the tactical sophistication he'd displayed, while Usopp was terrified by the sheer power he'd demonstrated. Sanji was impressed by how Luffy had managed to defeat Crocodile without killing him, while Chopper, who joined them during the Alabasta adventure, was fascinated by the physiological implications of his Gear Second technique. But it was Zoro's response that meant the most. "You've been holding back," the swordsman observed as they prepared to leave Alabasta. "All this time, you've been fighting at a fraction of your actual capability." "Not holding back," Luffy corrected. "Using the right amount of force for each situation. Mihawk taught me that overwhelming power without restraint isn't strength, it's just destruction. And if you'd used your full power from the beginning," Luffy's smile was equal parts confident and sad, "then I wouldn't have learned anything, and neither would any of you. Sometimes the hard way is the only way that teaches you what you need to know." The philosophy carried them through the next phase of their journey as they encountered increasingly dangerous opponents who tested different aspects of their capabilities. Skypia presented challenges that were as much philosophical as physical. Enel's god complex and casual disregard for human life represented everything that Luffy had been trained to oppose, while his lightning-based powers created tactical problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. "You dare to challenge a god?" Enel demanded when Luffy finally confronted him in the heart of his golden city. "I don't see a god here," Luffy replied calmly, his rubber body providing natural immunity to the Lightning Man's most devastating attacks. "I see someone who's forgotten that power comes with responsibility." The battle that followed was spectacular and decisive. Enel's lightning was indeed devastating, capable of destroying entire sections of the Sky Island with casual gestures. But his arrogance had made him sloppy, too accustomed to opponents who couldn't resist his electrical attacks. Against Luffy's rubber-enhanced swordsmanship, enhanced by advanced Haki and tactical training that let him turn his natural immunity into overwhelming advantage, Enel's godlike power proved insufficient. "Gamu Gamu no Golden Rifle," Luffy announced as his Haki-enhanced fist struck the golden bell that had started the entire conflict, the resonant tone carrying across the Sky Island like a declaration of victory. But it was at Water 7 that Luffy's true growth became impossible to ignore. The confrontation with CP9 and the revelation of Robin's past forced the crew to confront challenges that went beyond simple combat. Political intrigue, moral complexity, and the kind of systematic injustice that couldn't be solved through individual heroics tested everything they'd learned about working together. "I want to live," Robin's declaration echoed across Enies' lobby with the force of absolute truth, and Luffy's response was immediate and unwavering. "Then live," he shouted back, his voice carrying across the government stronghold like a battle cry. "We'll tear down anyone who tries to stop you." The battle with Rob Lucci was the first time since Crocodile that Luffy had faced an opponent who pushed him to his absolute limits. The CP9 agent's mastery of the Six Powers techniques, combined with his leopard Zoan form and years of assassination experience, created a challenge that required everything Mihawk had taught him about adapting technique to circumstance. Gear 4th, Luffy announced as his body inflated with Haki-hardened muscle, taking on the distinctive appearance that would later become legendary. Swordsman form. The transformation was unlike anything the world had seen before. Instead of the purely physical enhancement of his earlier gear techniques, this version incorporated his swordsmanship training directly into his combat form. His blade became an extension of his Haki-enhanced body, creating attack patterns that combined overwhelming force with surgical precision. Lucci's speed was extraordinary, his cat-enhanced reflexes allowing him to move faster than most opponents could track. But Luffy's observation Haki had been honed through years of sparring with Mihawk, and his advanced armament techniques let him strike with enough force to damage even a Zoan user's enhanced durability. Gamu Gamu no, Luffy began, his enlarged form moving with impossible speed and precision. King Kong's sword. The attack combined everything he'd learned about power, technique, and restraint. His Gear 4th enhanced strength provided devastating force, while his swordsmanship training ensured surgical precision. The blow that struck Lucci was powerful enough to end the fight decisively, but controlled enough to avoid fatal injury. As the CP9 agent collapsed, defeated but alive, Luffy stood over him with an expression that mixed triumph with genuine sadness. "You're strong," he acknowledged, "but you use your strength to hurt people who can't fight back. That's not strength, that's just bullying with better technique." The escape from Enies' lobby became legendary throughout the Grand Line, a story of how a small crew of pirates had successfully challenged the world government's most secure facility and emerged victorious through courage, skill, and absolute determination. But for Luffy, the real victory was personal. He had proven, both to himself and to his crew, that the training Mihawk had given him could be used to protect the people he cared about from forces that seemed overwhelmingly powerful. Thriller Bark presented different challenges, supernatural opponents whose abilities couldn't be countered through conventional means, and moral complexities that tested Luffy's understanding of justice and mercy. The confrontation with Gecko Moria was philosophically troubling. The warlord's ability to steal shadows and create zombie armies represented a form of violation that went beyond simple physical harm. He was stealing people's very identities, reducing them to shadows of their former selves. But it was the battle with Ryuma, the legendary samurai's reanimated corpse, that provided Luffy's most profound test of swordsmanship since leaving Kuraigana Island. "You fight well, young swordsman," Ryuma observed as they clashed in the depths of Moria's fortress, their blades creating sparks that lit up the Gothic architecture. "But you lack the killing intent of a true warrior." "Maybe," Luffy admitted, his technique flowing in patterns that Mihawk would have recognized with pride. "But I think that makes me stronger, not weaker." The duel was everything Luffy had trained for, a pure test of swordsmanship between opponents who had dedicated their lives to the art of the blade. Ryuma's techniques were classical and perfect, honed through centuries of legend and enhanced by his undead state's freedom from physical limitations. But Luffy's style was alive in ways that the zombies could never be. His rubber-enhanced techniques created angles of attack that no traditional swordsman could replicate, while his advanced Haki allowed him to strike with force that transcended mere physical capability. "Gamu Gamu no," Luffy announced as he prepared his final technique. Jet Sword Storm. The attack was a whirlwind of steel and rubber, each strike delivered with perfect precision and devastating force. When it ended, Ryuma stood motionless for a moment before his zombie form finally collapsed, Brook's shadow returning to its rightful owner. "Well fought," the legendary samurai whispered as his borrowed body crumbled to dust. "You fight with honor, young one. That is, more valuable than you know." But it was the encounter with Bartholomew Kuma that truly demonstrated how far Luffy had come since leaving East Blue. The warlord's arrival at Thriller Bark should have been a disaster. His pawpaw fruit abilities were devastating, capable of deflecting any attack and teleporting opponents to random locations across the world. His cyborg enhancements made him nearly indestructible, while his political position made him effectively untouchable. Against a normal crew, Kuma would have been an insurmountable obstacle. But the Straw Hats were no longer normal. "You're strong," Kuma observed as Luffy's Gear 4th enhanced attacks actually forced the cyborg to take defensive action. "Stronger than the reports indicated, but strength alone will not be sufficient for the challenges ahead." "Then it's good that I have more than just strength," Luffy replied, his enhanced senses picking up the complex network of emotions and motivations that drove the mysterious warlord. The battle that followed was less a fight than a test. Kuma evaluating Luffy's capabilities, while the pirate captain demonstrated growth that exceeded even Mihawk's highest expectations. Advanced Haki techniques, rubber-enhanced swordsmanship, and tactical sophistication that turned potential defeat into stalemate. When Kuma finally departed, teleporting away with his characteristic casual efficiency, he left behind words that would haunt Luffy's dreams for months to come. "The path you've chosen leads to Sabahodi Archipelago," the cyborg said. "When you arrive there, you will face challenges that will test everything you believe about strength and justice. Be prepared to discover that power without political understanding is ultimately meaningless." The warning proved prophetic. Sabahodi Archipelago was unlike anywhere the Straw Hats had visited before, a place where all of the Grand Line's contradictions and injustices were concentrated into a single location. Slavery was legal, nobles were untouchable, and the world government's authority was absolute. It was also where they encountered their first celestial dragons. The sight of St. Charlos casually shooting a civilian for the crime of accidentally making eye contact was the kind of injustice that Luffy had spent his entire life training to oppose. But Mihawk's lessons about political complexity warred with his natural instincts for direct action. "You can't," Nami whispered urgently as she saw the expression on her captain's face. "They're world nobles. Attacking one would bring an admiral here." "I know," Luffy replied, his voice carrying a weight of controlled fury that made everyone around him take a step back. But when St. Charlos raised his weapon toward Kami, the young mermaid who'd become their friend, Luffy's restraint finally broke. "Gamu Gamu no," he began, his body moving before conscious thought could intervene. "Jet pistol." The punch that struck the celestial dragon was delivered with surgical precision, enough force to render him unconscious, but carefully controlled to avoid permanent injury. It was, by Luffy's standards, an act of remarkable restraint. It was also an act of war against the world government. The aftermath was chaos incarnate. Admiral Kizaru's arrival turned Sabahodi into a battleground, while Bartholomew Kuma's reappearance brought challenges that tested every limit of the crew's capabilities. "You have grown strong," Kuma observed as he faced the assembled Straw Hats. "But not yet strong enough for what lies ahead. This separation will be necessary for your development." Despite their combined efforts, despite Luffy's advanced techniques, Zoro's three-sword style, and the crew's perfect coordination, Kuma's powers proved overwhelming in ways that pure combat ability couldn't overcome. As his crew members vanished one by one, teleported to unknown locations by the cyborg's inexorable power, Luffy felt the weight of his limitations in ways he hadn't experienced since childhood. "I couldn't protect them," he whispered as the last of his friends disappeared, leaving him alone on the battlefield with an opponent he couldn't defeat. "Protection through strength is only the beginning," Kuma replied, his voice carrying what might have been sympathy. "True leadership requires understanding forces beyond individual capability. Learn this, and perhaps next time will be different." The paw-shaped shockwave that sent Luffy flying toward Amazon Lily was almost gentle compared to the devastation it could have caused. But as consciousness faded and the archipelago disappeared beneath him, Luffy understood that his Grand Line education was far from complete. Strength, technique, and noble intentions weren't enough. To truly protect the people he cared about, he would need to become something more than just the world's most skilled fighter. He would need to become a leader worthy of changing the world itself. Consciousness returned to Luffy like a tide, slowly, painfully, bringing with it the bitter taste of failure and the crushing weight of separation from everything he held dear. The familiar Gothic architecture of Kuraigana Island's castle swam into focus above him, and for a moment he wondered if the entire Grand Line adventure had been nothing more than an elaborate dream. Then he tried to sit up, and the very real agony of his injuries reminded him that dreams didn't leave scars. "Awake at last," Mihawk's voice carried its usual measured tone, though Luffy's enhanced empathy caught undertones of concern that his former teacher would never openly acknowledge. "You've been unconscious for 3 days." "My crew," Luffy croaked, his voice raw from screaming their names as Kuma's power had torn them away from him one by one. "Where are scattered across the world?" Mihawk interrupted gently. Bartholomew Kuma's abilities transported each of them to different locations. They are alive, but recovering them will require time and considerable effort. The words hit Luffy like physical blows. His crew, his family, had been ripped away from him, and there was nothing he could do about it. All his training, all his strength, all his noble intentions had proven insufficient when it mattered most. "I failed them," he whispered, the admission carrying a weight of despair that seemed to age him years in moments. "Yes," Mihawk agreed with characteristic bluntness. "You did." The The stark honesty was jarring, but somehow less painful than false comfort would have been. Mihawk had never been one for gentle lies or soothing platitudes, and Luffy found something almost reassuring in his teacher's refusal to soften harsh truths. The question, Mihawk continued, settling into the chair beside Luffy's bed, is what you intend to do about it. Over the following days, as Luffy's physical injuries healed and his emotional wounds began to scab over, the full scope of his failure became clear. Reports filtered in through news coup deliveries and Den Mushi communications. His crew members were indeed alive, but scattered to locations that would take months or years to reach under normal circumstances. Worse, his attack on St. Charlos had triggered exactly the kind of political backlash that Mihawk had warned him about. His bounty had skyrocketed, his crew was now classified as an extreme threat to world government authority, and admiral-level forces had been authorized to pursue them wherever they might surface. "You have become too dangerous to ignore," Mihawk explained as they reviewed the latest intelligence reports, "but not yet dangerous enough to command respect. You occupy the worst possible position, strong enough to be considered a threat, but not strong enough to make that threat meaningful." It was during one of these briefings that the news arrived that would change everything. "Portgas d'Ace has been captured," Mihawk announced, his voice carefully neutral as he read from a marine intelligence report. "He's been sentenced to public execution at Marinford in 1 week." The world seemed to stop. Luffy's brother, the hot-headed, loyal, impossibly brave brother who'd sworn to protect their family no matter what, was going to die. And Luffy, separated from his crew and still recovering from his own devastating defeat, was powerless to save him. "I have to go," Luffy said immediately, trying to stand despite injuries that hadn't fully healed. "I have to save him." "With what?" Mihawk's question was quiet but devastating. "Your current abilities were insufficient to protect your crew from a single warlord. Marineford will host 3 admirals, dozens of vice-admirals, and thousands of elite marines. What exactly do you imagine you can accomplish there?" The logic was unassailable and completely irrelevant. Ace was family, and family meant everything. Luffy would rather die trying to save his brother than live knowing he hadn't made the attempt. "Then make me stronger," he said with desperate intensity. "You trained me for 10 years, train me for 1 more week, make me strong enough to save him." Mihawk was quiet for a long moment, studying his former student with eyes that seemed to see through to his very soul. "1 week," he said finally, "is not enough time to fundamentally alter your capabilities, but it might be enough to help you understand abilities you already possess but have never fully explored." What followed was perhaps the most intensive training regimen in the history of swordsmanship instruction. 18 hours a day of pure combat development, focused not on learning new techniques, but on perfecting and integrating abilities that Luffy had been developing organically throughout his adventures. "Your observation Haki has the potential for future sight," Mihawk explained during one brutal session, their blades moving in patterns too fast for normal eyes to follow. "You've been unconsciously accessing it for months, but never with conscious control. Learn to do so deliberately, and you can fight opponents who are faster or stronger than you." The breakthrough came on the 3rd day, during a sparring session that pushed both combatants to their absolute limits. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds at most, Luffy saw the attack that was coming, not through inference or pattern recognition, but through direct perception of the immediate future. Mihawk's thrust, aimed at a point where Luffy would be in another second, met empty air as the younger swordsman moved to avoid an attack that hadn't technically happened yet. "Again," Mihawk commanded, and they continued until Luffy could maintain future sight for brief moments at will. "Your armament Haki has the potential for internal destruction," Mihawk continued during another session, this one focused on technique refinement rather than pure combat. "You've been unconsciously using it in your advanced attacks, but never with surgical precision. Learn to control it completely, and you can bypass virtually any defense." The development was agonizing, literally. Internal destruction required such precise control of Haki flow that mistakes resulted in damage to the user's own body. By the end of each training session, Luffy's hands were raw and bleeding from the spiritual energy he was learning to channel. But the results were undeniable. When properly applied, the technique allowed him to damage targets from within their own defenses, making armor and even Logia intangibility much less protective. "Your Gear 4th has the potential for multiple specialized forms," Mihawk observed during yet another punishing session. "You've been using a generalized combat enhancement, but the technique can be adapted for specific tactical requirements." This development required the most creativity, as it involved adapting his existing abilities rather than learning entirely new ones. Working with Mihawk's analytical approach to combat optimization, Luffy developed 3 distinct Gear 4th variants. Boundman remained his general combat form, balanced between offense, defense, and mobility for sustained fighting. Tankman emphasized defensive capability and raw power at the cost of mobility, perfect for situations requiring him to absorb tremendous punishment while protecting others. Snakeman prioritized speed and precision over raw force, ideal for opponents who were faster than him or required surgical striking accuracy. But it was the final development that proved most significant. "Your sword is beginning to show signs of permanent Haki infusion," Mihawk noted as he examined the blade that had served Luffy faithfully throughout their adventures. "With sufficient focus and understanding, you could begin developing a true black blade." The process was unlike anything in Luffy's previous experience. Creating a black blade required more than just channeling Haki through a weapon. It required creating a spiritual bond between wielder and sword that transcended normal tool use. "The blade must become an extension of your will," Mihawk explained as they worked through the complex meditation techniques required. "Not just a tool you wield, but a part of yourself that you happen to hold in your hand." By the end of the week, Luffy's sword had developed the faintest hint of the permanent black coloration that marked truly legendary weapons. Not yet a complete black blade, but well on its way to that prestigious status. More importantly, the intensive training had crystallized abilities that had been developing unconsciously throughout his Grand Line adventures. He could now access future sight deliberately, use internal destruction with precision, and adapt his Gear 4th techniques to specific tactical requirements. But as they prepared for the journey to Marineford, both teacher and student understood that even these enhanced abilities might not be sufficient for what lay ahead. "Remember," Mihawk said as they stood before his coffin boat, prepared for what might be their final journey together, "strength without wisdom becomes tyranny, but wisdom without strength becomes irrelevance. At Marineford, you will need both in perfect balance." The journey to the marine stronghold was conducted in grim silence, both men understanding the enormity of what they were attempting. Mihawk's presence would complicate the political situation enormously. A warlord openly supporting an enemy of the world government would have ramifications far beyond the immediate battle. But when Luffy had asked for his help, the world's strongest swordsman had agreed without hesitation. "Why?" Luffy had asked. "This isn't your fight." "It became my fight when I chose to train you," Mihawk had replied. "A teacher's responsibilities don't end just because formal instruction has concluded." Marineford was visible from miles away, a fortress that seemed designed to intimidate through sheer scale and military precision. The execution platform stood at its center like an altar dedicated to the world government's absolute authority, while thousands of Marines filled every available space in perfect formation. And there, chained to the platform like a sacrifice to political necessity, was Ace. Even from a distance, Luffy could sense his brother's defiant spirit, battered but unbroken, facing death with the same fearless determination that had characterized their childhood adventures. "The plan remains unchanged," Mihawk said as their boat approached the outer defenses. "Create sufficient chaos to disrupt their formation, locate and free Ace, then extract before their superior numbers become overwhelming." It was a plan that depended on speed, precision, and more than a little luck. Against the assembled might of the marine forces, it should have been impossible. But as Luffy looked out at the fortress that held his brother, he felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving Kuraigana Island the first time: absolute certainty in his own capabilities. The battle began the moment they breached the outer harbor. "Gamu Gamu no Red Hawk," Luffy announced, his Haki-enhanced fist wreathed in flames as it struck the first line of marine defenses. The attack carved through their formation like lightning, creating the opening they needed to penetrate deeper into the fortress. But the real fighting began when the admirals took notice. Akinu's magma-enhanced attacks were devastating, capable of melting steel and vaporizing seawater with casual gestures. His absolute justice philosophy made him utterly ruthless, willing to sacrifice marine lives if it meant eliminating perceived threats. "So you're the brat who thinks he can challenge the world government," the admiral growled as his magma fists created craters in the fortress's stone architecture. "Time to learn what real power looks like." The battle that followed was unlike anything Luffy had experienced before. Akinu's raw power was extraordinary, each attack carrying enough force to level buildings, while his Logia abilities made him nearly impossible to damage through conventional means. But Luffy was no longer fighting conventionally. "Gear 4th, Snakeman," he announced, his body taking on the streamlined form he'd perfected during his intensive training. His enhanced speed let him match Akinu's aggressive attacks, while his future sight allowed him to anticipate the Admiral's strategy. Advanced armament, internal destruction. His punches began bypassing Akinu's magma defenses entirely, striking the man inside the Logia transformation with devastating force. For the first time in the battle, Akinu was forced to take a step backward. Impossible, the Admiral snarled, blood trickling from wounds that shouldn't have existed. No one can touch me when I'm transformed. My teacher told me that understanding your opponent's abilities is more important than overpowering them, Luffy replied, his combat form allowing him to strike from angles that conventional fighters couldn't reach. You're not invincible, you just haven't fought anyone who knew how to hurt you. The revelation that Luffy could damage Logia users sent shockwaves through the Marine ranks. If their most powerful combatants weren't untouchable, then conventional tactical assumptions became meaningless. But it was the encounter with Sengoku that demonstrated just how far Luffy's abilities had evolved. You dare to challenge the justice of the world government, the fleet admiral demanded as his Buddha form towered over the battlefield like a golden giant. I dare to protect my family, Luffy replied, his own form shifting into Gear 4th. Tankman as he prepared to face an opponent whose power dwarfed even the admiral's. And family isn't defined by your laws. The clash between Buddha and Rubber was spectacular and philosophically profound. Sengoku's attacks carried the weight of absolute authority, each strike delivered with enough force to shatter mountains. But Luffy's enhanced defenses and tactical understanding let him absorb punishment that would have destroyed lesser opponents while delivering counterattacks that actually forced the fleet admiral to defend. How? Sengoku demanded as Luffy's King Kong gun technique, enhanced with internal destruction, actually staggered his supposedly invincible Buddha form. Your bounty doesn't reflect this level of capability. Because I wasn't fighting to destroy, Luffy replied, his breathing heavy but controlled as he prepared for another exchange. I was fighting to protect, there's a difference. But it was the final confrontation, the race to reach Ace before the execution could be carried out, that tested every limit of Luffy's enhanced abilities. With seconds remaining before the axe fell, with Admiral Kizaru's lightspeed attacks creating barriers of photon energy between him and the execution platform, Luffy reached deeper into his capabilities than ever before. Gear 4th, King Mode, he announced, his body taking on a form that combined elements of all his previous techniques while transcending their individual limitations. The speed was superhuman, fast enough to match Kizaru's light-based attacks while maintaining enough power to punch through admiral-level defenses. His future sight extended several seconds into the potential timeline, allowing him to navigate the chaotic battlefield with supernatural precision. The strike that shattered Ace's chains was delivered with such perfect timing and overwhelming force that the execution platform itself collapsed from the residual energy. Luffy, Ace's voice carried disbelief, hope, and overwhelming gratitude as his younger brother's arms wrapped around him in a protective embrace. I told you I'd get stronger, Luffy replied, his enhanced form beginning to show the strain of prolonged combat. Strong enough that nobody would ever have to sacrifice anything to protect me again. But even enhanced abilities had limits, and the sustained battle against multiple admiral-level opponents was pushing Luffy beyond what his body could endure. His Gear 4th techniques were consuming massive amounts of energy, while the precision required for future sight and internal destruction was mentally exhausting. We need to go, he told Ace, scanning the battlefield for escape routes while his enhanced senses tracked the approaching marine reinforcements. I can't maintain this much longer. The extraction was as chaotic as the infiltration, with Luffy using every technique Mihawk had taught him to create opportunities for escape while protecting Ace from the overwhelming enemy response. His sword work carved through marine formations with surgical precision, while his rubber-enhanced mobility let him navigate the fortress's architecture like a three-dimensional maze. But it was Mihawk's intervention that ultimately made their escape possible. Kokudo Yoru, the world's strongest swordsman, announced as he drew his legendary blade, the black sword that had become synonymous with absolute mastery. World's strongest slash. The attack that followed bisected the entire marine fortress, creating a chasm hundreds of meters wide that temporarily separated the brothers from their pursuers. It was a demonstration of power so overwhelming that even the admirals were forced to reassess their tactical options. Go, Mihawk commanded as he prepared to hold off the inevitable counterattack. This diversion will not last long. I won't leave you, Luffy protested, loyalty warring with tactical necessity. You will, Mihawk replied firmly, because protecting those you care about sometimes means making difficult choices. This is my choice to make. As Luffy and Ace escaped Marineford aboard one of the marine vessels that Luffy had commandeered through rubber-enhanced piloting skills, the fortress behind them burned with the intensity of a battle that would reshape the world's political landscape. The rescue had succeeded, but at a cost that wouldn't be fully understood for years to come. The world government's invincibility had been publicly challenged, their strongest defenders had been fought to a standstill, and the balance of power that had maintained relative stability was now fundamentally altered. But for Luffy, holding his injured brother while they sailed towards safety, only one thing mattered. You came for me, Ace whispered, his voice breaking with emotion that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. Even though it was impossible, even though it meant fighting the entire world, you came for me. You're my brother, Luffy replied simply. I'll always come for you. As they sailed away from the burning fortress, both brothers understood that their lives had been fundamentally changed by the events at Marineford. The world government would never stop hunting them, their friends and allies would be targeted for association, and the path ahead would be more dangerous than anything they'd previously imagined. But they were alive, they were together, and they had proven that even the world's most powerful institutions could be challenged when family was at stake. Somewhere behind them, Mihawk stood atop the ruins of Marineford, his sword gleaming in the smoke-filled air as he faced down the assembled might of the marine forces. His student had succeeded, had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded even his own ambitious expectations. The hawk had raised a worthy heir. The world would never be the same. The world had changed overnight. News of the Marineford incident spread across the Grand Line like wildfire, carried by news crews whose frantic flight patterns suggested even they understood the magnitude of what had occurred. The headlines were stark and uncompromising. Marine fortress destroyed, Fire Fist Ace rescued, world's strongest swordsman defects, government authority challenged. But it was the bounty updates that truly reflected the new reality. Monkey D. Luffy's wanted poster now bore a figure that made seasoned pirates pause in disbelief. 1,500,000,000 berries. The highest bounty ever placed on someone who wasn't yet 20 years old. More troubling for the world government was the subtitle beneath his name, The Hawk's Air Threat Level, Revolutionary. Luffy studied his new poster while sitting on the deck of their commandeered marine vessel, the irony not lost on him that they were sailing toward the new world in a ship bearing the flag of their enemies. Beside him, Ace was slowly recovering from his ordeal, though the psychological scars of near execution ran deeper than any physical injury. 1.5 billion, Ace whistled, examining the bounty poster with a mixture of pride and concern. That's more than most Yonko commanders. It's also a death sentence, Luffy replied quietly, his enhanced senses picking up the subtle changes in his brother's emotional state. The government will never stop hunting us now. Everyone we care about becomes a target. The weight of that realization had been growing heavier with each passing day. By rescuing Ace, Luffy had fundamentally altered the world's power balance, but at a cost that extended far beyond his own safety. His crew, still scattered across the world, would now face unprecedented danger. His allies would be hunted simply for association with his name. "Do you regret it?" Ace asked, and the question carried depths that had nothing to do with simple curiosity. Luffy was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the immediate consequences, but the long-term implications of his choices. Mihawk's training had taught him to think strategically, to consider the broader ramifications of individual actions. "No," he said finally, "but I understand the cost now in ways I didn't before. Getting stronger isn't just about being able to protect people, it's about being able to live with the consequences of that protection." Their destination was Fishman Island, the underwater kingdom that served as the gateway to the New World. But intelligence reports suggested their arrival would be far from the peaceful transit they'd originally planned. "The world government has issued new directives regarding Fishman Island," Ace reported, reading from intercepted marine communications. "Something about preventing terrorist elements from accessing New World shipping lanes." Translation: they were going to try to close off the island rather than risk Luffy's crew reuniting in the New World's chaotic political environment. The descent to Fishman Island revealed the full scope of the government's response. Marine vessels surrounded the underwater kingdom in formations that suggested siege warfare rather than protective patrol. Underwater barriers had been erected at key approach routes, while specialized units equipped for aquatic combat maintained constant vigilance. But Luffy's enhanced capabilities had evolved considerably since their last underwater adventure. His observation Haki now extended far enough to map the entire defensive network, while his improved understanding of advanced techniques offered options that conventional pirates wouldn't possess. Gear Second. Aquatic mode, he announced, his physiology adapting to underwater combat in ways that pushed his devil fruit abilities into unexplored territory. The rubber-enhanced swimming techniques he developed during his training allowed him to move through water with surprising speed and agility, though the familiar weakness remained. More importantly, his advanced Haki techniques functioned normally even while submerged, giving him capabilities that the marine defenders hadn't anticipated. The infiltration of Fishman Island became a masterclass in tactical adaptation. Instead of attempting to force their way through the marine blockade, Luffy used his enhanced senses to locate unguarded approach routes, while his advanced techniques created diversions that drew defensive forces away from critical areas. Amazing, King Neptune observed as Luffy demonstrated his abilities during their audience in Ryugu Palace. Your mastery of both devil fruit powers and Haki in an aquatic environment defies conventional understanding. My teacher believed in adapting technique to circumstance rather than forcing circumstances to fit technique, Luffy replied, though his attention was focused on the complex political situation that his presence had created. Fishman Island was caught between competing pressures: loyalty to the human pirates who'd helped them in the past, fear of world government retaliation, and their own deep-seated racial tensions that made every interaction fraught with historical baggage. It was these tensions that Hody Jones exploited in his bid for power. Humans are the enemy, the shark fishman declared as his new fishman pirates seized control of the island's strategic locations. They've proven it by bringing their war to our peaceful kingdom. Now we'll show them what real strength looks like. The coup was swift and brutal, leveraging both legitimate grievances and manufactured outrage to create support for radical action. Hody's energy steroid-enhanced abilities made him genuinely formidable, while his followers' fanatical dedication created challenges that couldn't be solved through simple combat superiority. But it was the philosophical dimension of the conflict that proved most challenging for Luffy. "You're part of the problem," Hody declared during their inevitable confrontation in the palace courtyard. "Your very presence here proves that humans see this island as nothing more than a stepping stone to their own goals. You're right that the world government has treated your people badly," Luffy acknowledged, his combat stance defensive rather than aggressive. "But hurting innocent people won't fix that injustice, it'll just create new injustices." The battle that followed was unlike any Luffy had fought before. Hody's steroid-enhanced abilities pushed his physical capabilities to supernatural levels, while the underwater environment created tactical challenges that tested every aspect of his enhanced training. But more than that, the fight took place in front of an audience whose opinions would shape Fishman Island's future relationship with the surface world. How Luffy conducted himself, the techniques he used, the restraint he showed, the respect he demonstrated, would be remembered long after the immediate crisis was resolved. "Gear 4th, Neptune Mode," Luffy announced as his body adapted to aquatic combat while maintaining the enhanced capabilities of his advanced forms. The transformation was spectacular and precisely controlled. His enlarged physique moved through water with fluid grace, while his advanced Haki techniques created pressure waves that affected the underwater environment without causing structural damage to the palace. "Impossible," Hody gasped as Luffy's attacks bypassed his steroid-enhanced defenses through applications of internal destruction that the shark fishman couldn't comprehend. "No human should be able to fight like this underwater." "I'm not fighting like a human," Luffy replied, his technique flowing in patterns that incorporated both his training with Mihawk and his understanding of aquatic combat dynamics. "I'm fighting like someone who refuses to let hatred create more hatred." The final technique was one Luffy had been developing specifically for opponents whose strength came from artificial enhancement rather than genuine training. "Gamu Gamu no," he began, his body positioning for an attack that would demonstrate overwhelming capability while avoiding permanent harm. Poseidon's Sword. The strike combined his stretched reach with underwater pressure dynamics and advanced armament Haki to create an attack that bypassed Hody's artificial enhancements entirely. The shark fishman collapsed, his steroid-enhanced abilities overwhelmed by technique that targeted his natural physiology rather than his temporary augmentations. But it was the aftermath that truly mattered. Why? Princess Shirahoshi asked as she watched Luffy help tend to Hodi's injuries, despite the fishman's attempts to kill him. After everything he said about humans, after everything he tried to do, why are you helping him? Because hatred that creates more hatred never actually solves anything, Luffy replied, his enhanced empathy sensing the complex mixture of emotions radiating from the young mermaid princess. Someone has to be willing to break the cycle. The political resolution that followed was complex and fragile, requiring diplomatic skills that Luffy had developed under Mihawk's guidance but never fully tested. The Fishman Island government's relationship with the surface world needed to be restructured in ways that addressed legitimate grievances while avoiding the kind of radical solutions that Hodi had represented. "We will remember your restraint," King Neptune declared during the formal ceremony that marked the end of the crisis. "And we will remember that strength can be used to heal as well as harm." But it was the private conversation with Jinbei that provided the most important intelligence about what lay ahead. "The new world is not like paradise," the whale shark fisherman explained as they prepared for departure. "The Yonko who rule those waters operate on scales of power that make the warlords seem like regional threats. And your actions at Marineford have upset balances that have maintained stability for decades." "What kind of balances?" Luffy asked, his strategic thinking having evolved considerably since his early days as a pirate captain. "The kind that keep the four emperors from openly warring against each other," Jinbei replied grimly. Big Mom, Kaido, Blackbeard, and until recently, Whitebeard maintained territories through mutual deterrence. With Whitebeard's forces scattered and Ace's survival changing the political calculation, that deterrence is breaking down. The implications were staggering. Luffy's rescue of Ace hadn't just saved his brother, it had potentially triggered a power struggle that could reshape the entire new world. "There's something else," Jinbei continued. "Intelligence reports suggest that Caesar Clown has been conducting illegal experiments on Punk Hazard using children as test subjects. The world government has been trying to keep it quiet, but with their attention focused on hunting you, their ability to contain the situation has deteriorated." Punk Hazard. Luffy remembered the name from Marine Intelligence reports, a former government research facility that had been abandoned after a chemical weapons accident. If Caesar was using it as a base for human experimentation. "We have to stop him," Luffy said immediately. "It's a trap," Jinbei warned. "The government knows you'll respond to threats against innocent people. They're probably counting on your predictability." "Then we'll spring the trap," Luffy replied with the kind of confident determination that had characterized his approach to impossible challenges since childhood. "But we'll do it on our terms." The journey to Punk Hazard took 3 days through waters that grew increasingly treacherous as they approached the new world's chaotic weather patterns. But Luffy's enhanced senses allowed him to navigate hazards that would have destroyed lesser vessels, while Ace's fire-based abilities provided defense against environmental threats. The island itself was a study in contrasts, one half locked in perpetual winter, the other burning with toxic gases that made the air itself lethal. The abandoned research facilities stood like monuments to scientific hubris, their twisted architecture bearing testament to experiments that should never have been attempted. "The children are being held in the central laboratory," Luffy reported after extending his observation Haki to its maximum range. "But Caesar's presence is strange. His emotional signature suggests he's not just conducting experiments, he's enjoying them." The infiltration required every stealth technique Mihawk had taught him, combined with environmental adaptations that pushed his devil fruit abilities into unexplored territory. The toxic atmosphere that permeated the facility would have been lethal to normal humans, but Luffy's rubber physiology provided some protection, while his advanced Haki techniques allowed him to function despite the hostile environment. Caesar Clown proved to be exactly as repulsive as the intelligence reports had suggested. A scientist whose brilliance had been completely divorced from any sense of moral responsibility. His gas-based logia abilities made him formidable in an environment filled with toxic chemicals, while his sadistic enjoyment of others' suffering created motivations that went beyond simple criminal profit. "Welcome to my laboratory, Straw Hat," Caesar declared as poisonous gases swirled around him like living weapons. "You're just in time to witness the culmination of my research into biological enhancement through chemical manipulation." The battle that followed tested every aspect of Luffy's enhanced capabilities. Caesar's mastery of gas-based attacks created environmental hazards that couldn't be overcome through simple physical superiority. while his scientific knowledge allowed him to exploit weaknesses in ways that conventional fighters couldn't match. But Luffy's training had prepared him for opponents who relied on environmental advantages rather than personal skill. "Gear 4th, Hazmat Mode," he announced, his body adapting to toxic environments while maintaining his enhanced combat capabilities. The transformation was both practical and spectacular. His rubber physiology became even more resistant to chemical effects, while his advanced Haki created barriers that protected him from Caesar's most devastating gas attacks. More importantly, his enhanced speed and precision allowed him to rescue the captive children while simultaneously engaging Caesar in combat. Multitasking that required the kind of tactical awareness that only years of intensive training could develop. "Impossible," Caesar shrieked as Luffy's attacks continued to affect him despite his Logia intangibility. "My gas form should be immune to physical attacks. My teacher told me that every power has weaknesses," Luffy replied, his advanced armament Haki allowing him to strike Caesar's true body even when the scientist was transformed. "You just have to understand the principles involved." The technique that finally ended the battle was one of Luffy's most sophisticated, a combination of advanced Haki, environmental manipulation, and precise timing that turned Caesar's own abilities against him. "Gamu Gamu no," Luffy began, his body positioning for an attack that would demonstrate the difference between genuine mastery and scientific artifice. "Purification Cannon." The strike created a vacuum effect that compressed and expelled all the toxic gases from the immediate area, leaving Caesar solid and vulnerable for just long enough to deliver a precisely calibrated blow that ended the fight without causing fatal injury. As the scientist collapsed, defeated but alive, Luffy turned his attention to the more important task of ensuring the children's safety and beginning the complex process of medical treatment for their artificially induced addictions. "You saved us," one of the children whispered, her voice breaking with emotion that cut through Luffy's enhanced emotional defenses like a blade. "We saved each other," Luffy replied gently, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "You were brave enough to survive until help could arrive. That's the hardest part." But it was the intelligence they discovered in Caesar's laboratory that provided the most troubling insights into what lay ahead. These research notes mention someone called Joker, Ace reported as they examined the scientist's files. "Apparently he's been funding Caesar's experiments as part of some larger operation involving artificial devil fruits." Luffy's enhanced senses picked up familiar patterns in the emotional resonance surrounding that name, the kind of calculating malevolence he'd encountered before in opponents who viewed other people as tools rather than individuals. "Doflamingo," he said quietly, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fit together in his mind. The Shichibukai's involvement suggested that Caesar's experiments were just one element of a broader conspiracy that extended into the highest levels of the world government's operations. Artificial devil fruits, human experimentation, and political manipulation, all connected by threads that led back to someone with enough influence to operate with virtual impunity. As they prepared to leave Punk Hazard with the rescued children and evidence of the illegal experiments, Luffy found himself contemplating the growing complexity of the challenges ahead. Each victory seemed to reveal new layers of corruption and conspiracy. Each rescued innocent exposed additional victims who needed protection. The simple goal of becoming Pirate King was evolving into something far more complex, a comprehensive challenge to systems of power that treated human suffering as acceptable collateral damage. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Ace asked as their ship sailed away from the toxic island, carrying refugees whose lives had been forever altered by scientific ambition, unchecked by moral restraint. Luffy looked out at the chaotic waters of the New World, his enhanced senses picking up the emotional signatures of countless individuals whose lives were being shaped by forces beyond their control. Pirates, marines, revolutionaries, nobles, all playing parts in a grand political drama whose rules had been written by people who considered themselves above consequences. "I don't know if anyone can be ready for changing the world," he replied honestly, "but I know that someone has to try." Behind them, Punk Hazard burned with cleansing fire as Ace's abilities consumed the toxic chemicals that had poisoned the island's atmosphere. It was a small victory in a war that seemed to grow larger with each battle, but it was also proof that individual actions could create meaningful change. Ahead lay the territories of the Four Emperors, Yonko, whose power dwarfed anything they'd faced before, whose influence extended across entire regions of the New World. But Luffy had been trained by the world's strongest swordsman, had proven himself capable of challenging the world government's authority, and had demonstrated that strength could be used to heal as well as harm. The path to becoming Pirate King would lead through their domains, and every step would test not just his physical capabilities, but his understanding of what it truly meant to be worthy of that title. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across waters that had never known peace, the sound of storms both natural and political that would reshape the world itself. Luffy smiled as he felt the familiar weight of Shank's straw hat on his head, a reminder of promises made and destinies accepted. The new world was about to discover what happened when someone trained by Dracule Mihawk decided to change everything. The first thing Luffy noticed about Dressrosa wasn't the vibrant colors of its architecture or the festive music that seemed to pour from every street corner. It wasn't even the living toys that walked among humans, as if such impossibilities were mundane everyday occurrences. It was the strings. His enhanced observation Haki picked them up immediately, thousands upon thousands of nearly invisible filaments that crisscrossed the island like a spider's web, connecting buildings, people, and even thoughts in ways that defied natural explanation. The emotional signatures they carried were wrong, too controlled, too uniform for a population that should have been displaying the chaotic diversity of human feeling. "Something's not right here," Luffy said quietly as the Thousand Sunny approached Dressrosa's harbor, his voice carrying a weight of certainty that made his crew pay immediate attention. "What do you mean?" Nami asked, though she'd learned to trust her captain's unusual insights over their years together. "The people," Luffy replied, his enhanced senses painting a complex picture of the island's inhabitants. "They're all happy, too happy, like someone's forcing them to feel that way." Law, who had been remarkably tense since they'd first spotted the island, looked up from the charts he'd been studying with obvious relief that someone else had noticed the wrongness. "That would be Doflamingo's influence," the Surgeon of Death explained grimly. "His string fruit allows him to manipulate people like puppets, controlling their actions and even their emotions through parasitic threads." The explanation sent a chill through the assembled crew. They'd faced opponents with devastating physical abilities before, but someone who could control minds represented a different order of threat entirely. "How many people is he controlling?" Luffy asked, his observation Haki stretching out to assess the full scope of the manipulation. "Potentially the entire island," Law replied, though he typically focuses on key individuals, government officials, military leaders, anyone whose influence can be leveraged to maintain his control. As they disembarked and began exploring Green Bit, the jungle island where Law was supposed to make his exchange with Doflamingo, Luffy found himself analyzing the tactical situation with the kind of strategic sophistication that Mihawk's training had developed in him. A devil fruit user who could control both people and environment through string manipulation. An island-wide population under various degrees of mental influence. Political corruption that extended to the highest levels of the world government's operations. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Law's personal vendetta against someone who destroyed his childhood. "This isn't just about stopping a warlord," Luffy observed as they navigated through Green Bit's dangerous flora. "This is about freeing an entire kingdom from systematic mind control." The philosophical implications were staggering. How do you liberate people who don't know they're imprisoned? How do you fight an enemy who can turn your allies against you with a gesture? How do you win a battle when your opponent can rewrite the rules of engagement in real time? The answer, Luffy realized, lay in everything Mihawk had taught him about adapting technique to circumstance rather than forcing circumstances to fit technique. The confrontation with Doflamingo began before they ever reached the main island. "Fufufu, so the infamous Straw Hat has finally come to visit my kingdom," the voice echoed across Green Bit's jungle canopy, carrying with it an aura of casual menace that made lesser pirates flee in terror. Doflamingo descended from the sky like a fallen angel, his distinctive pink coat billowing in wind that seemed to obey his will. Invisible strings connected him to clouds above, allowing him to move through the air with the grace of someone who had never known the limitations of gravity. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled, hidden behind tinted glasses that reflected the world back at itself while revealing nothing of the mind behind them. "Don Quixote Doflamingo," Luffy replied, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt in a gesture that carried its own unmistakable message. "I've heard you've been playing puppet master with innocent people." "Innocent?" Doflamingo's laughter was like breaking glass. "There are no innocent people, only those who lack the power to act on their desires. I've simply given them the freedom to be what they truly are." The philosophy was seductive and completely wrong, representing everything that Luffy had been trained to oppose. Power used to dominate rather than protect, strength divorced from responsibility, control disguised as liberation. "You're wrong," Luffy said simply, "and I'm going to prove it." What followed was perhaps the most complex battle Luffy had fought since Marineford, not because of raw power differentials, but because of the tactical sophistication required to counter an opponent whose abilities operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Doflamingo's strings were nearly invisible and impossibly sharp, capable of cutting through steel and stone with casual ease. But more than that, they could be used to control people, manipulate environment, and even suture wounds in ways that turned potential weaknesses into tactical advantages. "String shot," Doflamingo announced as razor-thin filaments erupted from his fingers like bullets, each one capable of piercing armor while simultaneously attempting to attach to Luffy's body for puppeteer control. But Luffy's years of training with Mihawk had prepared him for opponents whose abilities created multiple simultaneous threats. His observation Haki tracked each individual string, while his enhanced speed allowed him to avoid most attacks entirely. More importantly, his swordsmanship provided solutions that conventional fighting couldn't offer. "Gamu Gamu no Jet Sword," he announced, his blade moving in precise arcs that severed Doflamingo's strings while maintaining enough control to avoid damaging innocent bystanders who might be caught in the crossfire. The technique was a masterpiece of precision and restraint, cutting through supernatural materials while protecting everyone else in the immediate vicinity. It was exactly the kind of advanced application that demonstrated the difference between mere technique and genuine mastery. "Impressive," Doflamingo acknowledged, though his tone suggested amusement rather than concern. "But you're still thinking like a conventional fighter. Let me show you what real power looks like." Parasite. The attack was unlike anything Luffy had encountered before, strings that bypassed his physical defenses entirely, attempting to attach directly to his nervous system and turn his own body against him. For a moment, his left arm moved without conscious command, his own strength becoming a weapon pointed at his allies. But Mihawk's training had included more than just physical techniques. The meditation practices, the mental discipline exercises, the philosophical discussions about the nature of will and control, all of it had prepared him for exactly this kind of assault. "Advanced armament. Internal flow," Luffy said quietly, his haki surging through his body with such intensity that it severed Doflamingo's control strings from within. The shock on the warlord's face was deeply satisfying. "Impossible," Doflamingo snarled, his casual confidence cracking for the first time. "No one can resist the parasite technique through pure willpower." "Not willpower," Luffy corrected, drawing his sword in a motion that seemed to cut through reality itself. "Understanding. My teacher told me that every power has weaknesses, you just have to comprehend the principles involved." The battle that followed was a masterclass in tactical adaptation. Doflamingo's abilities were formidable, but they operated according to rules that could be analyzed and countered through sufficient intelligence and skill. His strings required line-of-sight targeting, which meant that superior speed and unpredictable movement patterns could create openings. His puppet control needed physical contact, which advanced armament Haki could prevent. His environmental manipulation was powerful but not limitless, meaning that sustained pressure could overwhelm his ability to maintain multiple techniques simultaneously. "Gear 4th Swordsman form," Luffy announced as his body inflated with Haki-hardened muscle while maintaining perfect integration with his blade work. The transformation was spectacular. His enlarged form moved with impossible speed and precision. Each sword strike delivered with enough force to carve through buildings, while maintaining the surgical accuracy needed to avoid civilian casualties. But it was the philosophical dimension of their conflict that proved most significant. "You fight to control people," Luffy observed as their battle carried them across Greenbit's jungle canopy. "But real strength comes from protecting their freedom to choose." "Freedom is an illusion," Doflamingo screamed, his attacks becoming more desperate as he realized that conventional tactics weren't working. "Power is the only truth. Those who have it make the rules, and those who don't suffer the consequences." "Then I guess I'll have to be more powerful than you," Luffy replied with the kind of cheerful determination that had characterized his approach to impossible challenges since childhood. The technique that finally broke through Doflamingo's defenses was one of Luffy's most advanced. A combination of his devil fruit abilities, his swordsmanship training, and the advanced Haki techniques that Mihawk had spent years helping him develop. "Gamu Gamu no," he began, his body stretching as he prepared an attack that would demonstrate the difference between power used for domination and strength used for protection. King Kong's sword storm. The assault was devastating and precisely controlled. His rubber-enhanced reach allowed him to strike from impossible angles, while his advanced swordsmanship ensured that every cut served a specific tactical purpose. Doflamingo's string defenses were systematically dismantled, his environmental advantages negated, his psychological manipulation countered by overwhelming physical capability, guided by unshakable moral certainty. When the dust settled, the warlord lay defeated but alive, his power broken and his authority over Dressrosa finally ended. But the real victory wasn't the defeat of a single opponent, it was the liberation of an entire population from systematic mental control. As Doflamingo's influence faded, the true nature of Dressrosa began to reveal itself. The living toys transformed back into the humans they'd always been, families were reunited after years of enforced separation, and the artificial happiness that had masked genuine suffering finally gave way to authentic emotion. "Thank you," Princess Rebecca said as she knelt before Luffy in the ruins of the Colosseum where he'd fought to protect her father's memory. "You've given us back our freedom to choose our own feelings." "You always had that freedom," Luffy replied gently, helping her to her feet with the kind of respect that Mihawk had taught him to show to all people regardless of their station. "Sometimes you just need someone to help you remember it." The political aftermath was complex and far-reaching. Doflamingo's defeat had implications that extended far beyond Dressrosa's borders, disrupting smuggling operations and criminal networks that spanned the entire New World. But it was the intelligence they discovered in the warlord's fortress that provided the most troubling insights into what lay ahead. These documents detail something called Operation Eternal Youth, Law reported as they examined Doflamingo's private files. Apparently, there's someone in the New World who's been collecting information about advanced medical procedures that could theoretically grant immortality. The implications were staggering. Someone with enough influence to coordinate with warlords and world government officials was pursuing the kind of power that could fundamentally alter the balance of global politics. There are references to someone called Kaido of the Beasts, Law continued, his voice growing increasingly grim as he read through the documents, and mentions of artificial devil fruit research being conducted in a place called Wano Country. Luffy's enhanced senses picked up the complex mixture of emotions that surrounded those names: fear, anticipation, and something that felt disturbingly like hunger for violence on a scale that dwarfed anything they'd previously encountered. "Kaido," he said quietly, testing the name and finding it heavy with implications he couldn't yet fully understand. "One of the 4 emperors," Law explained, "known as the strongest creature in the world. If Doflamingo was working with him." The sentence hung unfinished in the air, its implications too vast and terrible to complete. As they prepared to leave Dressrosa, Luffy found himself contemplating the growing complexity of the challenges ahead. Each victory seemed to reveal new layers of conspiracy and corruption. Each defeated enemy exposed connections to even more dangerous opponents. The simple goal of becoming Pirate King was evolving into something far more comprehensive. A systematic challenge to networks of power that treated human freedom as a commodity to be traded rather than a right to be protected. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Rebecca asked as she saw them off at the harbor, her eyes reflecting the kind of gratitude that came from genuine liberation. Luffy looked out at the chaotic waters that separated Dressrosa from the territories controlled by the 4 emperors, Yonko, whose individual power exceeded anything he'd yet faced, whose influence shaped entire regions of the New World. "I don't know if anyone can be ready for fighting the strongest creature in the world," he replied honestly. "But someone has to try." Behind him, Dressrosa celebrated its freedom with the kind of genuine joy that only came after systematic oppression had been lifted. Children played in streets where they'd once been afraid to speak. Adults made choices based on their own desires rather than external control. And the entire island seemed to exhale with relief that years of tension had finally been released. It was proof that individual actions could create meaningful change. That strength used responsibly could accomplish things that seemed impossible from any other perspective. But ahead lay challenges that would test not just his physical capabilities, but his understanding of what it truly meant to be worthy of the title he sought. The road to becoming Pirate King led through the domains of the 4 emperors, and each step would require him to evolve beyond what he currently was. Somewhere in the distance, storm clouds gathered over waters that had never known peace, the physical manifestation of political forces that would reshape the world itself. Luffy smiled as he felt the familiar weight of Shank's straw hat on his head, a reminder of promises made and destinies accepted. The training Mihawk had given him was proving its worth with each challenge, but the real test lay ahead. The new world was about to discover what happened when someone who'd been trained by the world's strongest swordsman decided that freedom was worth fighting for, even if it meant facing the strongest creature in the world to prove it. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a news coup whose nervous demeanor suggested it understood the significance of the message it carried. The envelope was crafted from the finest parchment, sealed with wax that bore the unmistakable mark of the Big Mom pirates, a skull wearing a chef's hat, grinning with predatory anticipation. But it was the emotional signature emanating from the letter itself that made Luffy's enhanced senses recoil in alarm. Layer upon layer of psychological manipulation, carefully crafted to trigger specific responses in whoever opened it. This wasn't just an invitation, it was a weapon disguised as diplomacy. "What does it say?" Nami asked, though the expression on her captain's face already suggested the news wouldn't be welcome. Luffy read the ornate script twice before responding, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that his crew had learned to associate with serious threats to their family. "Sanji is getting married," he announced, each word delivered with precision that made the statement sound like a death sentence. "To Charlotte Pudding, Big Mom's 35th daughter. The ceremony will take place on Whole Cake Island in 1 week." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone understood the implications immediately. Sanji would never willingly enter into a political marriage, which meant he was either being coerced or his infamous past had finally caught up with him. "It's a trap," Robin said quietly, her archaeological training having taught her to recognize the patterns of political manipulation that powerful families use to expand their influence. "Big Mom doesn't make alliances through marriage unless she gains something significant in return." "Then we go get him," Luffy replied with the kind of simple determination that had characterized his approach to impossible challenges since childhood. "Go get him?" Usopp's voice cracked slightly as the full scope of what that meant began to sink in. "From Big Mom, one of the 4 emperors, in the middle of her own territory." "Yes," Luffy confirmed, his tone suggesting that the danger level was irrelevant to the decision-making process. What followed was perhaps the most intensive planning session in the Straw Hat Pirates' history. Unlike their previous adventures, infiltrating a Yonko's territory required the kind of strategic sophistication that Mihawk's training had developed in Luffy, but his crew was only beginning to understand. "Big Mom's power isn't just her individual strength," Luffy explained as they gathered around detailed maps of Whole Cake Island and its surrounding territories. "She rules through fear, but also through genuine loyalty from people who believe she protects them. Attacking her directly would turn an entire population against us." The analysis was mature and politically sophisticated, exactly the kind of thinking that separated successful revolutionaries from mere rebels. Mihawk's lessons about the relationship between individual power and systemic change were finally finding practical application. "So what do you suggest?" Law asked. The Surgeon of Death had volunteered to assist with the mission, partly out of alliance obligations, but mostly because he recognized the strategic importance of preventing Big Mom from acquiring whatever advantage Sanji's marriage was supposed to provide. "Infiltration rather than invasion," Luffy replied, his tactical thinking having evolved considerably since their early Grand Line adventures. "We get in, locate Sanji, determine what's really happening, and extract him with minimal collateral damage." It was a plan that required capabilities most pirates simply didn't possess: the ability to move undetected through hostile territory, the skill to gather intelligence without alerting security forces, and the restraint to avoid escalating situations that could spiral into full-scale warfare. Fortunately, Luffy's training had prepared him for exactly these kinds of challenges. The journey to Whole Cake Island took them through the Totland Archipelago, a collection of themed islands that represented Big Mom's vision of a utopian society where all races could live in harmony under her absolute protection. The concept was seductive and the execution was genuinely impressive. Each island was perfectly maintained, the populations seemed genuinely content, and the cultural diversity was extraordinary. But Luffy's enhanced senses painted a more complex picture. "The happiness is real," he observed as they sailed past Candy Island, watching children play in streets made of actual confectionery. "But it's conditional. Everyone here knows that their safety depends on Big Mom's continued satisfaction with their behavior." The psychological dynamic was subtle but pervasive. Genuine gratitude, mixed with underlying terror, authentic community connections, shadowed by constant awareness that those connections could be severed at any moment by imperial displeasure. "It's brilliant," Robin murmured with the kind of academic appreciation that came from studying political systems throughout history. She's created a society where people police themselves because they're too afraid to risk losing what they've been given. The infiltration itself required every stealth technique Mihawk had taught him, enhanced by devil fruit abilities that had evolved far beyond their original limitations. Luffy's rubber physiology allowed him to compress his body into shapes that conventional infiltrators couldn't achieve, while his advanced observation Haki let him navigate security systems that relied on predicting normal human behavior patterns. But it was the philosophical complexity of the situation that proved most challenging. Whole Cake Chateau, Big Mom's primary residence, was simultaneously a palace, fortress, and family home. Hundreds of Charlotte children lived there, ranging from infants to adults with their own political ambitions. Many of them were genuinely innocent participants in a system they'd never chosen to be part of. Finding Sanji required threading through this maze of family relationships, political alliances, and personal loyalties without causing harm to people who didn't deserve to suffer for their mother's imperial ambitions. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't with Big Mom herself. She was busy preparing for the wedding ceremony that would cement her alliance with Germa 66. Instead, Luffy found himself facing Katakuri, Big Mom's second son and the family's most formidable combatant after the Yonko herself. "So you're the straw hat who's been causing so much trouble," Katakuri observed, his imposing figure radiating the kind of casual confidence that came from never having been defeated in combat. "My mother is very interested in meeting you." "I'm just here for my cook," Luffy replied, his hand resting on his sword hilt in a gesture that managed to convey both respect and readiness for violence. "Your cook is now part of our family," Katakuri corrected, his tone carrying absolute certainty. "The marriage contract has been signed, the political arrangements are finalized, and the ceremony will proceed as scheduled." The words carried layers of meaning that extended far beyond their surface content. This wasn't just about Sanji's personal freedom, it was about the balance of power in the new world, about alliance structures that had maintained relative stability for years, about the right of individuals to choose their own destinies versus the needs of larger political entities. "Then I guess I'll have to change those arrangements," Luffy said with the kind of cheerful determination that had characterized his approach to impossible challenges since childhood. The battle that followed was unlike anything either combatant had experienced before. Katakuri's Mochi Mochi fruit abilities made him incredibly versatile. He could reshape his body to avoid attacks, create weapons from his own substance, and adapt his fighting style to counter any technique his opponent displayed. More importantly, his advanced observation Haki gave him limited future sight capabilities, allowing him to anticipate attacks before they were fully formed. But Luffy's training had prepared him for opponents whose abilities operated on multiple levels simultaneously. "Gear 4th, Snakeman," he announced, his body taking on the streamlined form that prioritized speed and precision over raw power. The transformation was specifically designed to counter future sight users. His attacks could change direction mid-flight, creating unpredictable trajectories that made precognitive defense much more difficult. Combined with his advanced swordsmanship, it created attack patterns that even Katakuri's enhanced senses couldn't fully predict. "Impressive," Katakuri acknowledged as Luffy's Gamu Gamu no Jet Culverin technique forced him to actually dodge rather than simply reshape around the attack. "But you're not the only one who can see the future." What followed was a masterclass in advanced observation Haki combat. Two fighters whose enhanced senses allowed them to perceive potential outcomes several seconds before they occurred, creating exchanges that seemed to unfold in slow motion as each combatant adjusted their tactics based on futures that might or might not come to pass. But it was the philosophical dimension of their conflict that proved most significant. "Why do you fight?" Katakuri asked during a brief pause in their exchange, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than tactical probing. "To protect my family's freedom to choose their own paths," Luffy replied without hesitation. "And I fight to protect my family's safety and prosperity," Katakuri countered. "Your friend's marriage ensures that prosperity continues. Why should your desires take precedence over our needs?" It was a fair question, and one that went to the heart of everything Mihawk had taught him about the relationship between individual power and systemic responsibility. "Because nobody should have to sacrifice their dreams for someone else's political convenience," Luffy said finally. Not your family, not mine, not anyone. The technique that finally broke through Katakuri's defenses was one of Luffy's most advanced, a combination of future sight, advanced armament haki, and the precision swordsmanship that allowed him to strike at moments when his opponent's precognitive abilities were overwhelmed by too many potential futures to process simultaneously. Gamu Gamu no, he began, his body stretching as he prepared an attack that would demonstrate the difference between power used for control and strength used for liberation. King Cobra Sword, the strike bypassed Katakuri's Machi defenses entirely, delivering a precisely calibrated blow that ended the fight without causing permanent injury. As the sweet commander collapsed, defeated but alive, Luffy turned his attention to the more important task of locating Sanji. He found his cook in the castle's highest tower, staring out at the sunset with an expression that mixed resignation with barely suppressed rage. The reunion was complicated by revelations that neither of them had anticipated. Sanji's past with the Germa 66 royal family, the political implications of the marriage alliance, and the genuine affection that had developed between Sanji and Pudding, despite the artificial nature of their arrangement. "I can't leave," Sanji said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of impossible choices. "If I refuse the marriage, Big Mom will destroy the Barity. She'll hunt down everyone I've ever cared about and make them suffer for my decision." The moral complexity was exactly the kind of situation that Mihawk's training had prepared Luffy to navigate. Simple rescue wasn't enough, they needed to find a solution that protected innocent people while preserving everyone's freedom to choose their own paths. "What if we could change the terms of the arrangement?" Luffy suggested. "Make it so Big Mom gets what she needs without you having to sacrifice what you want." The negotiation that followed required every diplomatic skill Luffy had developed, enhanced by intelligence gathering that revealed the true nature of Big Mom's goals. The Yonko didn't actually need Sanji personally, she needed access to Germa 66's technology and military capabilities. The marriage was just the most convenient way to secure that access. But convenience could be replaced by alternative arrangements, especially when those alternatives were presented by someone whose power commanded respect even from emperors. The final confrontation with Big Mom herself took place in the castle's main dining hall, a cavernous space that could accommodate the Yonko's enormous appetite and equally enormous ego. She sat at the head of a table that stretched for hundreds of meters, surrounded by foods from every corner of the world and children whose diversity reflected her vision of racial harmony under imperial protection. "Straw Hat Luffy," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you've caused considerable disruption to my family's celebrations." "I apologize for that," Luffy replied with genuine respect, though his posture remained carefully balanced for combat if diplomacy failed. "But I couldn't let my friend be forced into a marriage he doesn't want." "Marriage is a contract," Big Mom corrected, her tone suggesting that individual desires were irrelevant to political necessities. "The boy's personal feelings are less important than the alliance his union will create." "Then let's create that alliance through different means," Luffy suggested, his strategic thinking having evolved to encompass possibilities that went beyond simple confrontation. What followed was perhaps the most complex negotiation in New World history, a discussion of trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and technological exchanges that could provide Big Mom with everything she needed from the marriage alliance while allowing Sanji to return to his chosen family. The breakthrough came when Luffy offered something that Big Mom valued more than political convenience: genuine respect for her vision of racial harmony, backed by the power to actually help implement that vision on a larger scale. "You rule through fear disguised as protection," Luffy observed during one crucial exchange. "But what if people chose to follow you because they believed in what you were building, rather than because they were afraid of what you might destroy?" The concept was seductive to someone whose entire worldview was built around being loved and feared in equal measure. More importantly, it offered possibilities for expansion that traditional conquest couldn't achieve. The final agreement was complex and fragile, requiring ongoing cooperation between organizations that had every reason to distrust each other. But it accomplished the essential goal: Sanji's freedom to choose his own path, while providing Big Mom with access to the resources she needed to maintain her empire's stability. "You fought well," Katakuri said as the Straw Hats prepared to depart, his tone carrying genuine respect despite their earlier conflict. "But more than that, you found a way to solve problems without creating new ones. That's rare in the New World." As they sailed away from Whole Cake Island, carrying with them a rescued crew member and a complex web of new political relationships, Luffy found himself reflecting on how much his understanding of leadership had evolved since leaving East Blue. "That was incredible," Sanji said as they watched Totland's themed islands disappear behind them. "You negotiated with a Yonko and got everything you wanted without starting a war." "Not everything I wanted," Luffy corrected. "Everything we all needed. There's a difference." The distinction was important, reflecting lessons about power and responsibility that Mihawk had spent years teaching him. True strength wasn't about imposing your will on others. It was about finding solutions that preserved everyone's essential freedoms while addressing legitimate needs and concerns. But as they sailed toward their next destination, intelligence reports began filtering in about developments in Wano Country that would test everything they'd learned about balancing individual desires against collective needs. Kaido, the strongest creature in the world, had been systematically destroying a nation's culture and identity for over 20 years. The people of Wano had suffered under his rule, while the outside world remained largely indifferent to their plight. And now, armed with everything Mihawk had taught him about strength, strategy, and responsibility, Luffy was finally ready to challenge an emperor whose power dwarfed anything they'd yet encountered. "Where to next, Captain?" Nami asked as she plotted their course through the chaotic waters of the New World. Luffy looked ahead toward the distant mountains of Wano Country, his enhanced senses already picking up the emotional signatures of a population that had never lost hope despite decades of oppression. "To finish what we started," he replied with quiet determination. "Time to prove that someone trained by the world's strongest swordsman can indeed become the Pirate King." The final test awaited in a land where dragons ruled through terror and samurai still dreamed of freedom. The first thing Luffy noticed about Wano Country wasn't the towering waterfalls that surrounded the isolated nation like liquid walls, or the traditional architecture that seemed frozen in time from a more elegant era. It wasn't even the immediate sense of oppression that hung over the land like a physical weight, pressing down on everything with the authority of absolute power. It was the swords. Even from miles offshore, his enhanced observation Haki could sense them. Thousands upon thousands of blades scattered across the island, each one carrying the emotional imprint of its wielder. Some hummed with pride and honor maintained despite decades of hardship. Others whispered with despair so profound it seemed to cut through the very air. But all of them shared a common thread: the unmistakable signature of warriors who had never truly surrendered, no matter what their circumstances might suggest. "This is it," Luffy said quietly as they approached the treacherous currents that had kept Wano isolated from the outside world for centuries. "This is where everything we've been preparing for comes together." His crew exchanged glances that mixed anticipation with apprehension. They'd grown considerably since their East Blue days, had faced warlords and emperors, and emerged victorious through skill, determination, and their captain's seemingly impossible ability to find solutions where none should exist. But Kaido was different. The strongest creature in the world had held Wano under his iron grip for over 20 years, systematically crushing not just military resistance, but the very spirit that made the nation what it was. He ruled through a combination of overwhelming personal power and strategic brutality that had broken cultures older and stronger than most countries. "The intelligence reports are concerning," Robin observed as she reviewed the information they'd gathered during their approach. "Kaido isn't just occupying Wano, he's rewriting it. Traditional crafts have been banned, historical records destroyed, even the language itself is being systematically suppressed." "Cultural genocide," Luffy replied, and the clinical precision of the term reflected years of studying under Mihawk's guidance. "He's not just conquering territory, he's erasing identity." The infiltration required every stealth technique Mihawk had taught him, enhanced by years of practical experience and devil fruit abilities that had evolved far beyond their original limitations. Wano's isolation wasn't just geographical. It was maintained through a complex network of surveillance and control that made unauthorized entry nearly impossible. But nearly impossible wasn't the same as actually impossible, especially for someone who'd been trained by the world's strongest swordsman. The transformation began the moment they set foot on Wano's shores. Luffy's appearance shifted with practiced ease, his clothes adapting to local styles, his posture adjusting to match the subtle body language that marked someone as belonging to this culture rather than being an outsider. More importantly, his approach to carrying and using his sword changed completely. Instead of the confident, almost casual relationship he developed with his blade over years of training, he adopted the reverent precision that characterized Wano's samurai traditions. "Impressive," Kindman observed when they finally made contact with the remnants of the resistance movement. The Foxfire Samurai's eyes tracked every detail of Luffy's sword work as the pirate captain demonstrated techniques that seemed to bridge the gap between foreign innovation and classical mastery. Your style carries echoes of the old ways, but adapted for capabilities we've never seen before. Who was your teacher? Dracule Mihawk, Luffy replied simply, and the name hit the assembled samurai like a physical blow. The world's strongest swordsman, Ashura Doji whispered, his scarred face reflecting a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. You were trained by Mihawk himself. For 10 years, Luffy confirmed. He taught me that strength without honor is just destruction, but honor without strength is just martyrdom. If you want to free Wano, you need both. The philosophical resonance was immediate and profound. These were warriors who had maintained their principles despite 2 decades of systematic oppression, who had never stopped believing in ideals that seemed to have been proven worthless by harsh reality. But here was someone who combined genuine power with genuine respect for the values they'd never abandoned. "Show us," Denjiro requested, his merchant disguise not quite concealing the intensity of a master swordsman evaluating potential. "Show us what someone trained by Mihawk can do." What followed was perhaps the most significant demonstration in Wano's recent history, not because of the techniques displayed, but because of what those techniques represented. Luffy's sword work was a perfect fusion of Mihawk's classical precision, with innovations that could only have come from someone who understood both traditional principles and supernatural capabilities. His rubber-enhanced techniques created attack patterns that no conventional swordsman could replicate, while his advanced Haki applications pushed the boundaries of what the assembled samurai had thought possible. But more than the individual techniques, it was his approach to combat that marked him as something unprecedented. Someone who fought with the focused intensity of a true master, while maintaining the kind of restraint that came from understanding the difference between strength and violence. "Gamu Gamu no Idoryu, flowing water cut," he announced as his blade carved through a massive boulder with surgical precision, the stone splitting along perfectly controlled lines that left detailed patterns rather than simple destruction. The technique was simultaneously devastating and beautiful, demonstrating capabilities that could reshape battlefields while maintaining the artistic sensibility that marked truly advanced swordsmanship. "Extraordinary," Hyogoro breathed, the old Yakuza boss's eyes reflecting decades of experience in evaluating dangerous individuals. "You fight like someone who learned from the greatest, but thinks like someone who's never forgotten what fighting is actually for." The intelligence gathering that followed revealed the full scope of the challenge they faced. Kaido's control over Wano wasn't just military, it was comprehensive, extending into every aspect of society through a combination of direct force and systematic psychological manipulation. The factories that had replaced traditional crafts weren't just producing weapons, they were destroying the cultural knowledge that gave Wano its identity. The entertainment districts weren't just providing distraction, they were creating dependencies that made resistance seem pointless. Even the food distribution systems had been redesigned to make survival dependent on collaboration with the occupation. "It's brilliant in its completeness," Luffy observed as they studied maps of the country's transformed infrastructure. "He's not just suppressing rebellion, he's making it impossible to imagine." But imagination, as Mihawk had taught him, was often the most powerful weapon available to those who understood how to use it properly. The plan that emerged from their strategy sessions was complex and multifaceted, requiring coordination between groups that had barely maintained contact during 20 years of oppression. More importantly, it required the kind of tactical sophistication that could turn Kaido's systematic approach against itself. "We don't just defeat him in combat," Luffy explained to the assembled resistance leaders. "We prove that everything he represents is wrong. We show the people of Wano that their culture, their values, their very identity is stronger than his power." The philosophy was sound, but implementing it required capabilities that went far beyond conventional rebellion. They needed to coordinate simultaneous actions across multiple regions, protect civilian populations from inevitable retaliation, and maintain operational security against surveillance systems that had been perfected over decades. Most challenging of all, they needed to do it in a way that honored Wano's traditions rather than simply replacing one form of foreign influence with another. The festival provided the perfect opportunity, a traditional celebration that Orochi had maintained as a way of demonstrating his supposed respect for local customs, while actually using it to showcase the futility of clinging to the past. But traditions that had survived 20 years of systematic suppression were stronger than their oppressors understood, and the festival's true meaning ran deeper than its surface celebrations. The Fire Festival isn't just entertainment, Tamar explained as she guided them through the cultural significance they needed to understand. It's when we remember everyone who died protecting what we believe in and promise to keep fighting until their sacrifice means something. The emotional weight of that tradition was staggering, 20 years of accumulated grief and determination, compressed into a single night when an entire population would choose between accepting their fate and reclaiming their destiny. When the attack finally began, it was unlike any battle in Wano's long history of warfare. Instead of traditional siege tactics or direct assault, the resistance struck through coordinated actions that demonstrated the power of cultural identity over military occupation. Traditional crafts were displayed in public spaces where they'd been banned for decades. Historical songs were sung in voices that had been silenced for a generation. Ancient dances were performed by people who had risked their lives to preserve the knowledge. But underlying all of it was the presence of warriors whose skills had been honed through decades of secret training, now finally revealed in service of the values they'd never abandoned. "Tonight we remember who we are," Kindman declared as samurai emerged from hiding places across the country, their swords gleaming with more than mere steel. "And we show the world that Wano's spirit can never be conquered." The battle for Onigashima was where everything came together, traditional samurai techniques enhanced by modern tactical understanding, cultural pride backed by genuine military capability, and individual heroism coordinated into strategic action that could actually achieve lasting change. Luffy found himself fighting not just as a pirate captain seeking victory, but as a swordsman whose training had prepared him for exactly this moment, the chance to use everything Mihawk had taught him in service of ideals that transcended personal ambition. "Gear forth, samurai form," he announced as his body took on enhancements specifically designed for the kind of honor-based combat that Wano's warriors had perfected over centuries. The transformation was spectacular and deeply respectful. His rubber abilities adapted to complement rather than replace traditional techniques. His advanced Haki applied according to principles that honored the spiritual dimensions of swordsmanship. His individual strength deployed in service of collective goals. But it was his confrontation with King, Kaido's strongest subordinate, that truly demonstrated how much his understanding of power had evolved since leaving Kuraigana Island. "So you're the one they call the Hawk's Heir," King observed, his imposing figure radiating the kind of casual confidence that came from never having been defeated in single combat. "Let's see if Mihawk's training can match the strength of someone who serves the strongest creature in the world." The battle that followed was everything Luffy had been preparing for since childhood, a test not just of technique, but of philosophy, not just of individual capability, but of the values that gave strength meaning. King's abilities were formidable, his Lunarian heritage granting him capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what should have been biologically possible. His flames burned with supernatural intensity, his durability exceeded even Zoan-enhanced standards, and his mastery of aerial combat created tactical challenges that ground-based fighters couldn't normally overcome. But Luffy's training had prepared him for opponents whose advantages seemed insurmountable. "Gamu Gamu no," he began, his body stretching as he prepared techniques that combined everything Mihawk had taught him about adapting to circumstances. "Skyward Sword Dance." The attack was a masterpiece of three-dimensional combat, using his rubber abilities to maneuver through aerial space while maintaining the precise timing and positioning that effective swordsmanship required. Each strike was delivered with enough force to affect even King's enhanced durability, while the overall pattern created openings that conventional aerial tactics couldn't exploit. "Impossible," King snarled as Luffy's techniques continued to find gaps in defenses that should have been absolute. "No ground-based fighter should be able to match aerial superiority." "I'm not fighting as a ground-based fighter," Luffy replied, his enhanced forms allowing him to match King's mobility while maintaining the tactical advantages that came from superior training. "I'm fighting as someone who learned that true strength comes from adapting to whatever circumstances require." The technique that finally ended the battle was one of Luffy's most sophisticated, a combination of advanced Haki, rubber-enhanced physics, and the precision swordsmanship that turned overwhelming power into surgical effectiveness. "Gamu Gamu no Imperial Sword, Ascending Dragon." The strike bypassed King's defenses through applications of internal destruction, while simultaneously demonstrating the kind of spiritual force that marked truly legendary techniques. When it ended, King lay defeated but alive, his power broken, and his absolute confidence in Kaido's invincibility finally shattered. But the real victory wasn't individual, it was collective, as samurai across Onigashima demonstrated that 20 years of oppression had failed to destroy the spirit that made Wano what it was. "You see," Luffy said to the defeated king, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from genuine understanding of what strength meant. "Power without purpose is just destruction. But when people fight for something they truly believe in, they become stronger than anyone who's just following orders." As the battle for Onigashima continued around them, with resistance fighters demonstrating capabilities that their oppressors had never suspected they possessed, Luffy prepared for the final confrontation that would determine not just Wano's fate, but the future of the entire new world. Somewhere above them, Kaido waited in his fortress, confident in power that had never been seriously challenged, secure in the belief that individual strength was all that mattered in determining who ruled and who obeyed. He was about to discover what happened when someone trained by the world's strongest swordsman decided that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. The path to becoming Pirate King led through this moment, this place, this choice between accepting the world as it was and fighting to make it what it should be. Luffy smiled as he felt the familiar weight of Shank's straw hat on his head, a reminder of promises made and destinies accepted. The training Mihawk had given him, the crew he'd assembled, the allies he'd inspired, everything had led to this. Time to prove that someone who'd learned honor from the world's strongest swordsman could indeed challenge the strongest creature in the world. The roof of Onigashima stretched out before them like an arena designed by the gods themselves, a perfect circle of ancient stone surrounded by nothing but empty air and the chaotic storm clouds that perpetually shrouded Kaido's floating fortress. Lightning split the sky in jagged patterns that seemed to respond to the emotional intensity building between the two figures who now faced each other across the rain-slicked battleground. Kaido stood at the platform's center, his massive form radiating the kind of casual menace that came from never having been truly challenged in single combat. The strongest creature in the world was exactly as imposing as the legends claimed, over 7 meters of muscle and scale, with eyes that held the accumulated weight of decades spent crushing anyone foolish enough to oppose his will. But it was the philosophical certainty in his stance that made him truly dangerous. This wasn't just a man who believed in the supremacy of individual power. This was someone who had proven that philosophy correct through 20 years of systematically destroying everything that suggested alternatives might exist. "So," Kaido said, his voice carrying across the platform with the authority of distant thunder, "you're the brat who thinks he can challenge me. The one they're calling the Hawk's Heir." Luffy stood at the platform's edge, his smaller frame seeming almost insignificant against Kaido's overwhelming physical presence. But there was something in his posture, a balance of relaxation and readiness that spoke of training so intensive it had become as natural as breathing, that made the size difference irrelevant. "I'm someone who thinks the people of Wano deserve better than living in fear," Luffy replied, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "And I'm someone who learned that real strength comes from protecting others, not dominating them." Kaido's laughter was like avalanches and earthquakes combined into a single sound of devastating amusement. "Protecting others, dominating them. Kid, power is power. Everything else is just pretty words that weak people use to make themselves feel better about being weak." His form began to shimmer and expand as he prepared to demonstrate his point through overwhelming force. "Let me show you what 20 years of absolute victory looks like." The transformation was spectacular and terrible. Kaido's already massive frame swelled to truly colossal proportions as he took on his full dragon form, a serpentine monster hundreds of meters long, with scales that gleamed like polished steel and flames that could melt mountains. His very presence seemed to warp reality around him, making the air itself heavy with the weight of his authority. "Blast breath," he roared, and the attack that followed wasn't just fire, it was destruction given physical form, a beam of energy that could have vaporized entire city blocks. But Luffy was no longer where the attack had been aimed. "Gear second," he announced quietly, his skin taking on the familiar pinkish hue as his enhanced blood flow pushed his capabilities beyond normal human limits. But this wasn't the same technique he'd developed years earlier. This version had been refined through countless battles and integrated with everything Mihawk had taught him about combat efficiency. His movement across the platform was almost teleportation, his enhanced speed allowing him to cover impossible distances, while his observation Haki tracked Kaido's massive form with supernatural precision. When he struck, it was with his sword, not the wooden practice blade of his childhood. but a weapon that had begun showing the telltale signs of becoming a true black blade through years of being infused with its wielder's will. Gamu Gamu no Jet Sword. The attack combined his rubber-enhanced speed with the precision swordsmanship that Mihawk had drilled into him over 10 years of intensive training. His blade, wreathed in advanced armament Haki, carved a perfectly controlled line across Kaido's supposedly invulnerable scales. For the first time in decades, the strongest creature in the world felt pain. Impossible, Kaido snarled, his dragon eyes focusing on the small cut that was already healing but shouldn't have existed at all. My scales have never been penetrated by conventional weapons. Good thing I don't fight conventionally, Luffy replied, already repositioning for his next attack. My teacher told me that every power has weaknesses, you just have to understand the principles involved. What followed was unlike any battle in the history of the New World. A clash between two completely different philosophies of strength, played out through techniques that pushed the boundaries of what should have been physically possible. Kaido's attacks were devastatingly powerful, each one capable of reshaping the battlefield through sheer overwhelming force. His Thunder Bagua technique moved faster than lightning while carrying enough impact to shatter mountains. His flame-based attacks burned with temperatures that could melt steel, while his wind-based techniques created pressure differentials that could crush normal humans without ever making physical contact. But raw power, no matter how overwhelming, was still subject to the tactical principles that Mihawk had spent years teaching his student. Luffy flowed around Kaido's attacks like water around stones, his enhanced observation Haki allowing him to perceive not just what the dragon was doing, but what he intended to do several seconds before the intentions became actions. His rubber physiology let him absorb impacts that would have killed normal fighters, while his swordsmanship provided surgical precision that turned defense into counterattack. Gear 3rd. Giant Sword, Luffy announced as his arm swelled to enormous proportions while maintaining perfect integration with his blade work. The technique that followed carved through one of Kaido's massive claws with the kind of precision that demonstrated the difference between mere size and genuine skill. "You're strong," Kaido acknowledged as he shifted back to his hybrid form, still massive, but compact enough for more sophisticated combat techniques. "Stronger than anyone I've fought in years. But strength without the will to dominate is just weakness disguised as nobility." His counterattack was everything Luffy had expected and more, a combination of raw physical power, supernatural speed, and combat experience that represented decades of never having encountered defeat. Kaido's Kanabo swung with enough force to split islands, while his movements demonstrated that even his colossal size couldn't slow down someone whose mastery of combat was absolute. But Luffy had been trained for this exact scenario. Gear 4th, Swordsman form. The transformation was spectacular, his body inflating with Haki-hardened muscle while maintaining the precise balance and fluid movement that effective swordsmanship required. This wasn't just enhanced physical capability, it was the perfect integration of everything Mihawk had taught him about adapting technique to supernatural abilities. The battle that followed was a masterclass in advanced combat technique. Every exchange pushed both fighters to the absolute limits of their capabilities, with Kaido's overwhelming power meeting Luffy's perfect technique in clashes that sent shockwaves across the entire floating fortress. But it was the philosophical dimension of their conflict that proved most significant. "You fight to protect people who can't protect themselves," Kaido observed during a brief pause in their exchange, his tone mixing respect with contempt. "But what happens when protecting them requires you to become like me? What happens when being strong enough to save them means being strong enough to rule them?" It was the fundamental question that had haunted every conversation Luffy had ever had with Mihawk about the relationship between power and responsibility, the point where noble intentions could become tyrannical control if the wielder of strength wasn't constantly vigilant about his own motivations. "Then I'll have to trust them to keep me honest," Luffy replied, his voice carrying the weight of years spent thinking about exactly this problem. "And I'll have to trust myself to remember that being strong enough to rule doesn't mean I have the right to rule." "Pretty words," Kaido snarled, his attacks becoming more desperate as he realized that conventional tactics weren't working. "But words don't change the fundamental nature of power." "No," Luffy agreed, his own techniques evolving in real time as the battle pushed him beyond what he'd thought were his limits. "But understanding does." The breakthrough came when Kaido's most devastating attack, a combination of all his abilities focused into a single overwhelming assault, met something unexpected. "Gear 5th, Luffy announced, and the transformation that followed was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. His body took on properties that seemed to defy every law of physics and devil fruit classification. His rubber abilities evolved beyond simple elasticity into something that resembled pure imagination given physical form. But more than that, his integration with his swordsmanship reached a level that transcended normal tool use. His blade became an extension of his will in ways that made the distinction between wielder and weapon meaningless. "Gamu Gamu no," he began, but the technique that followed had no name because it had never existed before. His attacks began moving in patterns that created their own reality, sword strikes that could bend space, rubber-enhanced techniques that ignored conventional physics, and Haki applications that affected not just the physical world but the spiritual dimensions that underlay all existence. "This is impossible," Kaido gasped as Luffy's evolved abilities began overwhelming defenses that had never been penetrated before. "Devil fruits don't work like this. Haki doesn't work like this. Combat doesn't work like this." "That's because you're thinking like someone who learned power," Luffy replied, his enhanced state allowing him to speak even while delivering attacks that reshaped the battlefield around them. Instead of someone who learned understanding, the philosophical distinction was crucial. Kaido had acquired his abilities through conquest and consumption, taking what he wanted from others and adding it to his personal arsenal. But Luffy had developed his capabilities through training and integration, learning to understand the principles that made power possible, rather than just accumulating power itself. Advanced armament. World penetration. The technique that followed was something Mihawk had theorized but never demonstrated, the application of spiritual force so precisely controlled that it could affect reality at the fundamental level. Luffy's sword now fully evolved into a true black blade through the intensity of the battle, carved through Kaido's supposedly absolute defenses as if they were made of paper. But more than that, it carried with it the accumulated weight of everything the technique represented. 10 years of training under the world's strongest swordsman, a lifetime of choosing protection over domination, and the hopes of an entire nation that had never stopped believing in the possibility of freedom. "Impossible," Kaido whispered as the attack connected, not just with his physical form but with the very foundations of his worldview. "Power is supposed to be absolute. Strength is supposed to be final. Winners aren't supposed to be wrong. Power is a tool," Luffy corrected, his enhanced state beginning to show the strain of pushing his abilities beyond their natural limits. "Strength is a responsibility. And winners are the people who make the world better for everyone, not just themselves." The technique that finally ended the battle was called Gamu Gamu no Badgering Sword, a combination of everything Luffy had ever learned about power, technique, and purpose, focused into a single attack that represented not just physical capability but spiritual certainty. His fist, enlarged to the size of a small mountain and wreathed in flames generated through friction, carried with it a blade that had transcended normal physical properties to become something closer to crystallized willpower. When it struck Kaido, the impact wasn't just physical, it was philosophical, demonstrating through overwhelming evidence that strength used to protect was fundamentally more powerful than strength used to dominate. The strongest creature in the world fell from the sky like a collapsing mountain, his defeat so absolute that even his legendary durability couldn't keep him conscious through the impact. As the dust settled and the storm clouds began to disperse, Luffy stood alone on the platform, his enhanced form flickering as the enormous energy expenditure began to catch up with him. His sword, now fully evolved into a black blade that ranked among the world's finest weapons, gleamed in the emerging sunlight like a beacon of everything the victory represented. But the real measure of success wasn't individual, it was collective. Across Wano Country, factory smokestacks stopped belching poison into the air as Kaido's industrial infrastructure ground to a halt. In the flower capital, citizens emerged from their homes to find that the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over their nation for 20 years had finally lifted. Children who had never seen clean rivers watched in amazement as the water began running clear for the first time in their lives. Most importantly, the samurai who had maintained their honor through decades of systematic suppression finally felt free to practice their traditions openly. Swords that had been hidden for 20 years were drawn in celebration rather than desperation, and ancient songs that had been sung only in whispers echoed across the countryside, with voices raised in triumphant joy. "You did it," Momonosuke said as he approached the exhausted but victorious pirate captain. "You actually defeated Kaido and freed our country." "We did it," Luffy corrected, his voice hoarse from the strain of his enhanced techniques but still carrying the warmth that had characterized his interactions with people since childhood. "All of us together, I just happened to be the one who got to throw the final punch. The political aftermath was complex and far-reaching. Kaido's defeat sent shockwaves across the New World that fundamentally altered the balance of power that had maintained relative stability for decades. The revelation that one of the four emperors could be defeated by someone who wasn't even 25 years old made every established power structure suddenly seem much more fragile. But for Luffy, the real victory was personal and philosophical. "I can feel it," he said to his crew as they prepared to celebrate with their Wano allies. "Everything Mihawk taught me about strength and responsibility, about understanding power rather than just accumulating it, it all came together in that final battle." Zoro, whose own swordsmanship had evolved considerably during their time in Wano, nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed genuine mastery in action. "Your blade," he observed, studying the weapon that had achieved Black Blade's status through the intensity of the battle with Kaido. "It's become something truly legendary. Mihawk will be proud when he hears about this." The mention of his former teacher brought a smile to Luffy's face, though it was tinged with the kind of complex emotion that came from surpassing someone who had given him everything necessary for that surpassing to be possible. "I can sense it too," he said quietly, his enhanced empathy picking up a familiar spiritual signature from thousands of miles away. "He knows. Somehow he knows." On Kuraigana Island, Dracule Mihawk stood in his castle's highest tower, his golden eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could see all the way to Wano Country through sheer force of will. The wine glass in his hand trembled slightly, not from any physical disturbance, but from the spiritual resonance that connected all truly masterful swordsmen across the vast distances of the world. "Well done," he murmured, his voice carrying a pride that few people had ever heard from the world's strongest swordsman. "You have become everything I hoped you could be, and more than I dared expect." The news that reached the world through Den Den Mushi communications and newspaper reports was carefully crafted to minimize panic, but the essential facts couldn't be disguised. Monkey D. Luffy, captain of the Straw Hat Pirates, had single-handedly defeated Kaido of the Beasts in personal combat. More significantly, he had done so while demonstrating a level of technical mastery and philosophical sophistication that marked him as something unprecedented in the modern era. A pirate who combined overwhelming individual power with genuine wisdom about how that power should be used. The bounty update that followed reflected this new reality: 3 billion berries, with a subtitle that made government officials across the world reach for stronger drinks. The Liberator threat level, world-changing. But perhaps the most significant response came from the Revolutionary Army, whose leadership recognized that Luffy's victory represented more than just the defeat of a single emperor. "He's proven that the system can be changed," Dragon observed as he studied intelligence reports about the battle's aftermath. "Not just opposed or survived, but actually transformed through individual action guided by principled understanding." The implications were staggering. If someone could indeed become powerful enough to reshape political reality while maintaining the kind of moral clarity that prevented that power from becoming tyrannical, then the fundamental assumptions that had governed global politics for centuries might need to be reconsidered. For Luffy himself, the victory marked not an ending but a transformation. The simple goal of becoming Pirate King had evolved into something far more comprehensive, a responsibility to use his proven capabilities in service of ideals that transcended personal ambition. "What's next?" Nami asked as they prepared to leave Wano, their mission accomplished but their larger journey far from complete. Luffy looked out at the ocean that stretched toward the horizon, his enhanced senses picking up the emotional signatures of countless individuals whose lives were still constrained by systems that treated human freedom as a luxury rather than a right. "We find the One Piece," he said with quiet determination, "and we use whatever power that gives us to make sure what happened here can happen everywhere else that needs it." Standing beside him, Ace clapped his brother on the shoulder with pride that mixed personal affection with genuine respect for what had been accomplished. "Sabo would have been proud," he said quietly, referring to the brother they'd lost but never forgotten. "He would have been proud of all of us," Luffy replied, his voice carrying the weight of promises kept and destinies fulfilled. "We kept the oath we made as children. We became strong enough to protect the people we care about." As the Thousand Sunny sailed away from Wano Country, carrying with it a crew whose capabilities had been proven against the strongest opposition the world could offer, Luffy felt the familiar weight of Shanks' straw hat on his head. The promise implicit in that gift, to become someone worthy of inheriting the dreams of the previous Pirate King, had been fulfilled through trials that tested not just strength but character. Behind them, Wano celebrated its freedom with festivals that would continue for weeks. Ahead lay the final stretch of the journey toward Laugh Tale and whatever secrets the One Piece might reveal about the true nature of the world they were working to change. But in this moment, sailing toward an uncertain future with absolute confidence in his crew's ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead, Luffy allowed himself to simply enjoy the satisfaction of having proven that someone trained by Dracule Mihawk could indeed become the Pirate King. The world had been changed by the example of strength used wisely, power wielded responsibly, and individual capability deployed in service of collective freedom. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he could almost hear Mihawk's voice offering the kind of understated approval that meant more than any public recognition. Technique will only carry you so far. Beyond a certain point, victory depends not on what you can do, but on who you choose to be. Luffy smiled as he adjusted the straw hat that had become the symbol of his commitment to making the world a better place. He had chosen to be someone worthy of the title Pirate King, and the world would never be the same. And there you have it, Luffy's incredible journey from 7-year-old charging at Mihawk with a stick, to Pirate King who defeated Kaido using everything his legendary teacher gave him. True power comes from protecting others and understanding responsibility. What was your favorite moment? The Black Blade techniques, the philosophical debates, that insane Kaido battle? Drop your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this, subscribe and let me know what other what-if scenarios you want to see next. Alright guys, that's a wrap. Peace out.